Welcome, everyone. This is our second day of inaugural economic policy papers on European and global issues, EPPG. And we are super excited to listen the paper by Yuriy and Maurice on You Only Live Twice. Let's hear about that. Yuriy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. For those who don't know, You Only Live Twice is the title of a James Bond movie, and it will become clear why we have this title for this paper. All right, so this paper is motivated by, Ukraine. It's the topic of this conference, and we all want to know what is going to happen to Ukraine after the war is over. Obviously, it's a forward-looking exercise. There is a lot of uncertainty about how things are going to play out. But having said this, we already have a lot of information about various strategies that have or have not worked in the past. And so we have already a lot of information about how economic growth can look like for Ukraine going forward. Now, to this end, to understand the history of what was happening in Ukraine, let me show you the macroeconomic history of Ukraine and also other countries in Eastern Europe. What you should see here is GDP per capita. For Ukraine, that's the big yellow line, and then also trajectories for other countries. And one striking kind of fact you see in this figure is that Ukraine started as a relatively rich country in the beginning of transition. But now when you fast forward 30 or something years, you see that Ukraine is now one of the most poor countries in the region. And you always wonder, how this can happen, that we have this extreme reversal of fortunes. And obviously, many things have happened over the years. And, what Maurice and I try to do is to kind of compress all this information into what we call 4 epochs of macroeconomic history of Ukraine. The first epoch is sort of standard. It's earlier stages of transition when we have massive collapse of output, not just in Ukraine, but everywhere else. Maybe in Ukraine it was particularly bad, but qualitatively it's a similar trajectory. Then we had epoch number 2, when we had a lot of liquidity in the global markets, very high commodity prices. It was great for Ukraine. It was great for other countries in Eastern Europe. We had very strong growth everywhere. Then we had the global financial crisis, which dented economic growth pretty much everywhere. But it was particularly bad in Ukraine for various reasons. The banking sector was not reformed, lots and lots of non-performing loans. The president of Ukraine was Yanukovych, who was infamously corrupt, so kind of lots and lots of problems there. And then the fourth epoch obviously was determined by Russian aggression, where you have annexation of Crimea, incursion in the Donbass, a massive banking crisis, a massive currency crisis, a huge economic crisis. And so basically for a number of years, Ukraine didn't really grow. And all these problems obviously culminated in the full-scale invasion, where we have a massive economic shock, negative economic shock, a huge economic contraction, big increase in unemployment, millions and millions of refugees, also millions of people who are internally displaced. Obviously, a very tragic situation. But having said this, when the war is over, we're going to move to a new epoch, which is going to have challenges and opportunities. For example, we have to go back to a peacetime economy. It's not an easy exercise. We talked yesterday a lot about the reallocation shock. Now we have to undo it, at least to some extent. It's not going to be easy. We have to do a lot of reconstruction because so much capital is destroyed. All sorts of problems that we had in Ukraine for so many years are still there. We have to address this long-term structural challenges. Probably the most important thing going forward is going to be that Ukraine this time has a real prospect of joining the European Union. And as people in Ukraine joke, at some point NATO will join Ukraine, so maybe this will happen too. But in any case, when you think about all these adjustments that need to happen in Ukraine, you have many important questions, and this paper is going to be focused on kind of 2 more narrow questions. One is, what is going to be the engine of economic growth? We know from basic macroeconomics, it can be either fueled by population growth or maybe by productivity gains or capital accumulation. We want to see what kind of strategy is going to be a reliable strategy, a safe bet for Ukraine when you think about economic growth. And in this context, we also want to know what kind of strategies can help Ukraine achieve convergence as quickly as possible to its Eastern European peers, right? What can bring Ukraine closer to Poland, Czechia, and other countries that are kind of in the peer group? Now, it's a one paper. We have about 80 pages. And if you want to have one-line summary of what we argue in the paper is that Ukraine will have to have a lot of investment, a lot of new capital. We have to have a lot of capital deepening. And in the rest of the talk, I'll try to elaborate on this point and hopefully convince you that what we say in this paper, this main point, is making sense. Now, going back to sources of economic growth, right? So population, productivity, and capital. Let's take a look at each of this in turn. This is population trends in Ukraine and in many other countries in this region. What you should see here is that population was definitely not growing in Poland, Czechia, Ukraine, many other countries. In fact, Ukraine, if anything, had a strong depopulation growth, and we'll probably talk more about this later today when we think about the housing stock and where this housing stock has to happen, how much of that we should have. In any case, when you look at this figure, it's hard to imagine that population growth is going to be the engine of economic development in Ukraine. If anything, we should worry that population is going to be shrinking. So it's not a source of growth for us. Productivity gains. This is from Penn World Tables. What you should see here is that in the early stages of transition, late 90s, 2000s, we had big gains in productivity. And it made a lot of sense because you start from the planned economy, which we know tends to be very, very mismanaged. As you move to the market, allocation of resources is improved, productivity is increasing. But what is also clear from this figure is that at some point you kind of reach a plateau and you don't really gain a lot of productivity. And especially striking for Ukraine, where it's still very low level of productivity. And since 2008, it's very hard to see any positive trend in the statistic. So kind of good news and bad news here. Good news is that you have space to grow, right? So it's good. But on the other hand, it's not clear why Ukraine didn't grow before. So it's a bit of a mystery. Maybe it's telling us it's not necessarily a reliable source of growth going forward. Now, the final source of growth, capital. This is probably one of the most striking figures in this paper. And it's telling us that Ukraine, despite shrinking population, had massive decreases in the stock of capital per capita, right? So it started as a capital abundant country, relatively capital abundant country. It's now one of the poorest countries in terms of capital intensity, right? So this huge decrease in the stock of capital. And this contrasts sharply with what we see for other transition countries where you have a lot of accumulation of capital. And you wonder how this can happen. What was the driving source of this? We know these countries didn't really have developed financial markets, capital markets. So capital has to come from somewhere, how they can get so much capital. Now, when you look at countries that made to the EU, Poland, Czechia, Romania, Bulgaria, and others, you see that they had massive inflows of foreign direct investment over the years. They also had a lot of structural funds flowing into these countries. Structural funds from the EU, cohesion funds, lots and lots of official bilateral flows that help these countries to upgrade their infrastructure and so on. You also see that some of the funding was coming from remittances. We all remember this proverbial stories about Polish plumbers going to the UK, making some money, and then sending at least parts of their checks back to Poland. This was definitely happening in the data, but it was small relative to what was happening in terms of FDI and official flows. Now, when you compare this experience with the experience of countries like Ukraine, countries that did not make it to the EU, you see a very different figure. Much less FDI, basically zero EU official flows, and a huge reliance on remittances. And we know remittances may be useful, but they are typically used to finance consumption. They are not really an investment for most countries. And you can clearly see the effects of these differences in the type of funding, FDI versus remittances. When you look at FDI here or here, this is stock, this is just one particular year, you see there is a very strong positive correlation between domestic investment and FDI, very strong correlation between TFP and the stock of FDI. We have EU countries here, this is Ukraine, this is Ukraine. You see countries that didn't make to the EU that tend to have lower levels of investment, also lower levels of TFP. Obviously, it is a correlation, but you can't escape thinking that it is somehow related to the fact that Poland, Czechia, and so on became members of the European Union. They became members of NATO. NATO gives you security. It makes countries investable. EU gives you access to a huge market. This is what incentivizes private businesses to invest in Poland, Czechia, and so on. And we certainly have some evidence consistent with this basic observation. For example, if you construct an impulse response of FDI to joining NATO or joining EU, you see that FDI is responding very strongly. Furthermore, even the kind of prospect of joining these organizations, if you start to have a serious talk about joining NATO, joining EU, you already start to see inflows of foreign direct capital into these countries. And it is also certainly consistent with all sorts of narrative evidence we have in the data. For example, Volkswagen and Skoda is kind of a prime example of how this can happen before Czechia joined NATO or the European Union. Now, when you put everything together, all these different sources of growth, we know countries, this is total output, it's not per capita, it's total output. These countries grew roughly by similar magnitudes, but the composition of growth was very different. The European Union, new member countries, they had a lot of capital deepening, right? So we see this huge increase in the stock of capital. This is much bigger than, and this is in log scale, right? So this is much bigger than the amount of capital that was added in non-EU members. So capital deepening was one of the biggest engines of growth in this region, right? A lot of investment in Poland, Czechia, and so on. Now, this is historical experience. It's telling us we have already an established playbook. Just, invest, and these countries are going to grow. If you have FDI, it's going to potentially create this virtuous circle where you attract even more investment, you raise productivity through technology transfer. This is going to make these places more livable, which is going to attract even more FDI, and this circle continues. But this historical experience does not mean that this is the maximum you can achieve. Right? So in principle, we can try to push the envelope and say, can we grow faster than Poland? Can we grow faster than Czechia? And to answer this question, we need to work with models because we have to think about counterfactuals. And to this end, we're going to develop 3 models, relatively simple, very intuitive, in the spirit of Ramsey and Koopmans. And we're going to add kind of one element at a time to see how much difference it's going to make and what kind of policy implications it's going to give us. One sort of modification of this is going to be that you can borrow capital from abroad and you can use capital as collateral to borrow even more capital from abroad if you have it. Another model is going to ask a question, okay, so suppose you have different types of investment. You can invest in human capital, which presumably raises productivity, or you can invest in physical capital. Physical capital can be used as collateral, human capital cannot. Is this going to affect the choice here? Another possibility here is that in principle, when we invest into more capital, we're going to raise the marginal product of labor. Wages are going to be higher. This is going to make Ukraine more attractive to refugees to return. And we want to see what is going to happen in this kind of model if we allow this channel to be operational. I don't have time to describe these models in great detail, but just to give you a gist of what we have there, in many ways, this model is very standard. You maximize utility of a representative household. We have a standard part for capital accumulation constraint. This is gross capital formation. This is depreciation. And then we have a new part, which is telling us that in principle, we can borrow capital from abroad. And the key parameter here is going to be gamma, which is telling us what fraction of domestic capital you can pledge as collateral when you borrow capital from abroad. And we're going to take this as an externality because, at least in the early years after the war, we will likely have a situation where private businesses will have a very hard time borrowing themselves. It has to go through the government. And so they will fail to internalize all the benefits of having more capital going forward. Now, when you start to work with this model, you very quickly arrive at optimality conditions, which are going to be very intuitive and also have, we think, profound implications for what policymakers should do to improve welfare. This is the consumption oil equation in the planar problem. This is decentralized economy. You can immediately see that the net return here is going to be higher than net return here, which means consumption will grow faster in this case relative to this case. And when you put 2 and 2 together, you quickly realize that the optimal trajectory for consumption in the planar case is going to start with a lower initial value, but then have faster growth towards the steady state. Intuitively, what this means is that you try to postpone consumption, direct resources towards investment, you accumulate more capital domestically, you borrow even more capital from abroad. This allows you to have even more capital domestically, and this kind of circle continues. And obviously, this green trajectory is going to be very superior to what you can have in a decentralized economy. So the main message here is that you'll have to limit constrained consumption in the short run, direct resources towards investment. How can you fix this problem if you work with a decentralized economy? Well, kind of the gist of this is you have to have some mechanism to constrain people from consuming alone. It may be financial repression, we discussed this yesterday, but it may be something else. For example, here we look at a VAT where the tax rate is declining over time. And so in the beginning here, the tax rate is going to be very high. When you move forward in time, this tax rate is going to be basically shrinking to zero. It's a very simple correction that you can do to bring economy to this desirable trajectory. You can do other interesting exercises. For example, you can ask yourself, suppose Ukraine learns that at some point it's going to be a member of the European Union and it's going to receive some aid, some lump sum money to support living standards or something like that. What will happen in this economy today or maybe in the near future? Now, you can use a simple phase diagram to study this kind of question. This is what will happen if there is no aid. We have initial level of capital stock, initial level of consumption, and then we gradually converge to this new steady state. If you have a promise of aid, right, that is, raising consumption, we know it's going to give us a new equilibrium here. And in principle, we should be jumping here and then converging to this new steady state. But because this aid is not there yet, right, and that's not a crazy proposition given how European Union is working, it will come, with some probability. But what will happen in this model is that if people think it's a serious thing, we will have an immediate consumption boom. And then depending on assumptions, we can have a situation where you basically have to eat into your capital to support consumption smoothing. And we know already Ukraine doesn't have a ton of capital, so it's not a good idea to do something like this. But maybe more problematically, if this aid never arrives, again, not a crazy proposition given how the European Union is working, then you can have a crash in the economy, and it's going to be even worse than we had initially. Okay. Now, you can do many other interesting exercises, and unfortunately, I don't have time to cover them in great detail. But what you can see in all these models consistently is that they all say you have to limit consumption in the short run. You have to direct resources towards more investment. In this model, where you have a choice between investing into human capital versus physical capital, you will have a similar result. You also want to have a limited consumption. But there is a new twist to this, that you want to invest into physical capital because you can use it as a collateral rather than human capital. And I think this has huge implications because we talk a lot about investment into human capital, and it is very important. But in this very simple model, it's a lot easier to accumulate physical capital than human capital. And this model is telling us you should direct your resources towards physical capital accumulation, focus on infrastructure, buildings, and so on, not humans necessarily. How about, attracting refugees? Well, here you will most likely have an externality. Well, firms don't understand that by raising wages, they make Ukraine a more attractive destination. And so they will fail to realize that by investing more, they can make Ukraine a more attractive destination, make it, a happier place in many ways. But, if you want to internalize this, you have to have, again, this correction. You have to have a tax on consumption. You want to direct resources towards investment. And this is, again, the same prediction that we have in these other models. Okay, so the general prediction from this model is that you want to limit consumption. How much capital do we need? Okay, ultimately, that's probably the most important question. And when you think about this, we have at least three important considerations. One is we know a lot of capital was destroyed in the war, right? This was probably the lower bound, $200 billion. Realistically, it's much more, but let's start with this number, $200 billion. If we believe the reconstruction stage is going to last for about 10 years, it means we have to have a flow of $20 billion for 10 years per year. So it's one consideration. Another consideration is that, remember, I told you that the capital stock in Ukraine was declining over time, while in other countries, peer countries, Poland, Czechia, and so on, it was increasing. If we want to have convergence, we have to fix this problem somehow. We have to stop Ukraine from falling behind, which means we have to have more investment. How much more? It's going to be $10 billion per year to just stop falling behind. Now, this is not enough to generate convergence to Poland, right? For that, we need to have more capital. How much more? Well, if you assume 5% convergence, then you need to have another $10 billion. Okay. Now, just to be clear, this is not necessarily FDI money or official funds. It's everything collectively, domestic savings, foreign capital, everything. $40 billion. Is this a big number? Yes, it is a very big number. Is this feasible? Yes, it is feasible, we believe. We have a lot of budgetary support flowing into Ukraine since the beginning of the war. We know FDI in Poland last year was $20 billion, and the previous years it was even higher. We know the EU budget is huge. It will be even bigger in the next round, and maybe there is some room to have money dedicated to Ukraine. We had already discussion about frozen Russian assets. It would be a very natural use of this resource to rebuild Ukraine. So there are lots and lots of possibilities to hit this number. It seems entirely feasible to us. But, to make this happen, we have to address kind of one big problem that is sitting there, which is that overhead. You look at the dynamics of public debt as a fraction of GDP, and we know the first time Russia kind of invaded Ukraine, there was a big increase in the level of public debt, and then it kind of worked its way through this and reduced the burden of debt. But now it's much higher, and the damage is also much higher. So we're already at 100% of GDP debt to GDP, 100% debt to GDP ratio. We know from other research this may be very bad for economic growth. So it's going to be a drag on the Ukrainian economy. So we have to address this problem somehow. The good news here is that a lot of that is through official channels from the EU, other countries, loans. And we know if you want to work with the Paris Club, it's a lot easier than working with bondholders. So there is a need to have a deep debt relief after the war. It also has an immediate implication here that if you want to continue supporting Ukraine, loans are not as great as grants, right? Well, we don't want to settle a country with even more debt. It's already kind of pushing what is sustainable. Obviously, there are many, many other things that are important when you think about reconstruction of Ukraine, how much capital we need, and so on. One issue here is political economy, right? If you want to constrain consumption, you emerge from the war, many people will really want to consume more. You have to, contain these impulses. It will be very difficult politically, but in principle, you can at least protect the vulnerable groups of population and make it easier on at least, some groups of the population. We know that after the war, there is typically, a lot of inflow of capital into, countries. It's very easy to plant the seeds of a future crisis. You have too much consumption, the real exchange rate is going to appreciate, and then we can have a bust at some point. This would be another reason why we want to constrain consumption in the short run, because we want to avoid this boom-bust dynamics. Absorptive capacity. Okay, so the country is destroyed by the war. How much new capital can it take on? Based on the historical experience after World War II or other countries affected by the wars in Europe, 20-25% investment rate, the share of investment in GDP after the war seems a doable number. Also, public investment share, 10% of GDP seems reasonable given what we know from other countries. I have not said anything about allocative efficiency, but obviously it's very important. It's not just the number of dollars that have to be invested into Ukraine. It's also about how we invest this money. And here we can do lots and lots of things even before the war is over, right? We can focus on institutional reforms. We can try to improve the efficiency of the banking sector. We can fight corruption. We can set up a reconstruction agency that presumably should minimize waste and duplication in the reconstruction effort. There are a few things which are unlikely to be very kind of big drivers of economic recovery. One is domestic savings, in part because a lot of wealth was wiped out during the war, so you don't have a stock of wealth that can be invested. Another one is that you have grossly underdeveloped capital markets, and we know it's very hard to launch this kind of thing in the short run. But it doesn't mean that you can't start working on this. Eventually, in maybe 10 years, you have to have a capital market that is going to sustain Ukraine on itself, right? So something that is going to mobilize resources domestically and channel those funds into investment projects. So-called minerals deal, infamous minerals deal. We don't think it's going to be a great source of growth for Ukraine, in part because the gestation lags are very long. It's going to take 10, maybe more years to develop a mine or some site where you can extract these minerals. It's not even clear where we have those minerals, so we have to have a survey, a geological survey to know, where it's going to be and if it's actually profitable to make it happen. Political risks are huge. It's hard to imagine that the next president or whoever is going to be in power is going to kind of sell off Ukraine to Trump or somebody else. It seems very unlikely, but we will see. And obviously, underdeveloped capital markets. If you want to use this as a collateral for more borrowing, it will be very hard to do because there is nothing like a developed capital market in Ukraine at this point. So to summarize, one striking thing we see in the data is that there was a gross miracle in Eastern Europe, right? In only 30 years, which is very, very short period of time, we had basically convergence of poorer countries like Poland and Czechia to the frontier of advanced Western economies like France, Italy, United Kingdom, which is really striking. What was the strategy? Productivity gains and a lot of capital deepening. And as I said earlier, if you focus on FDI, this is particularly attractive because it creates this virtuous circle. You have more capital, more technology transfer, higher incomes. These places become more livable, and so this circle continues. So if you want to have like a foolproof strategy, it's not clear what it is going to be exactly, but capital deepening will have to be an important element of this. Ideally, you obviously want to have productivity, but since we don't know how to engineer this in the short run, you can focus on capital accumulation. We'll also argue that what we saw in Eastern Europe is not the maximum. You can push the envelope. Right? In principle, if you direct even more resources into investment, you can have faster growth. We know this worked in the past. How do we know it's going to work for Ukraine? Everybody will tell you that past performance is not a guarantee of future success. But we think Ukraine is going to have this different this time, right? So why? Because we believe there is an overwhelming agreement in Ukraine that you have to move to the European Union. There is a very strong carrot, which is going to push through very difficult reforms and make it a more successful country, more like Poland, Czechia, and so on. Also, Europe has a very different take on Ukraine now. It's not a Russian sphere of influence. It's more a part of Europe. Also, the destinies of Ukraine and the EU are now much more connected when you face hostile Russia, revisionist China, disengaging the United States. So we're kind of in the same boat. We want to make sure that everybody is going to survive this. But maybe more importantly, when you talk to an average Ukrainian, they have this mindset that, you only live twice. Once when the country was born, which was 1991, and the second time when you face death in the face. So this is probably the last chance to make it all work. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. So who is discussing for Giancarlo or Charles? Yeah, go. First discussing Giancarlo Corsetti.
So, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This is an important rebirth. Maybe the EP lives more than twice. I show you, this is my office in the EU. One of my offices in the EU is there. I'm showing this because, not because I'm bragging about, because it may not be there soon. And this is to do with has to do with my discussion. So it's not this one, that one. So this paper, I learned a lot from this paper. I thought I knew some of this stuff. Actually, this paper changed my mind in many of the aspects of Ukraine history and everything. So this is a thick and targeted paper. Okay, so so you all go here like many pages, 80 pages, many graphs. It's just one line, investment. But it's one line which is a little bit articulated, no? Because basically they say, look, we draw in history, theory, empirical evidence. And at the end of the day, we say there are three goals: reconstruction, productivity technology, repatriation, reallocation of labor, also the internal displacement is there. There is one overarching distortion, which is they need inflow of money from abroad, so they need somehow to relax borrowing constraint. There is a priority, which is basically the only way in which you can do rapid accumulations through pledgeability of what you do. And there are two instruments, basically, or two sets of instruments. One, an instrument to convince Ukrainians not to jump, not to have a big consumption boom at the beginning, because they need to help the reconstruction. And then you can have subsidy, basically, to give the extra kick on investment on the side of pledgeability. Okay? So basically, the message is invest in pledgeable capital and invest in an institutional strategy that anchor expectation and institutions to the NATO for security and to the EU for basically institutional development and possibly aids. Now, it's a thick paper because if you look that's the argument, but it's many aspects. And being economists, there are lots of caveats to Handels's argument. So it's really like very carefully drafted to say, look, we need to look at the debate on what promotes growth, aids versus investment inflows, when they go badly, when they go well. There are 2, 3, or 4 sections in which you do history and historical comparison with other Eastern Bloc countries, peer group, to basically show that at the end of the day, the priority is FDI. There is something funny there because it's true that EU, NATO countries have more capital intensity, but the growth rate of productivity is lower than the others. And the argument is that the base is different from the beginning. So the growth rate seems not associated with capital inflows, but it's because of the measurement there. And then you go, one by one, FDI, official lending grants, remittances, accession to NATO and EU, nice arguments. There is this important aspect of productivity and technology. It's an exercise in growth accounting. There are remittances. So no stone is left unturned there. Like, you read it all. And then we get 3 growth models in which basically the 3 growth models is basically to say, look, anything we do, once you put a pledgeability, once you put a borrowing constraint, that is what, especially at the beginning, you want to deal with. You want to basically create more pledgeability. And then there is the next steps. Okay. Next step is where the problem starts, because it's how much you need and what is the situation today. Now, let me start from the next steps, which is how much capital is needed. So I cannot compete with Yuriy. Yuriy was extremely clear, so I'll just repeat what he says. He says that basically there is an estimate of $40 billion, of which 20 for reconstruction, housing, energy, utility, transport infrastructure, and the rest, 20 for convergence to peers, and plus, 20 for, let's say, 10 to not to fall behind, 10 to convergence to peers. So growing faster than Poland means catching up, going at the same level. So one aspect that I have here is that it's unclear to me that this is a number for capital needed or for external resources. It's important because there is a clear element of domestic resources mobilization, right? That is important there. So this 40 would be a mix of the two, I guess. And all this is basically, my line is that when you read the paper, there is an urgency from the Ukrainians of capital inflows, and patience. Because all this may come over time. So clearly there will be at one point some substitutability between saving and capital inflows. And this to get the time, to build time to get, allocation, efficiency, institutional capacity, financial deepening. So what I'm saying is that the paper looks like you have kind of convergence to steady state along a nice path. When you open the hood, it's actually many things are going on. They're going crisscrossing, and that is where I'm going next, which is this is something that when you teach, you remember, right? So when we do the typical model of neoclassical capital mobility, once you nail down the steady state C bar, you can improve the smoothing, but there's not much beef there. Okay, so it's not really the speed of convergence that is important. It's actually the steady state. And the capital deepening has to do with the steady state because basically the beef of the model is outside the model, which is the TFP or the productivity. So I think it's fine for their point that the model is there. Their model is about the switch from the red to the green. You want to be faster growth, and now you do that, you favor pledgeability of capital accumulation that can be pledged. But per se, that is not the problem. The problem is that this faster accumulation needs to go into something that is pledgeable and increase productivity. Okay. And actually, reading the paper, this is the Gorodnichenko. I mean, this is something that Srinivasan taught me the first class in growth, but Gorodnichenko wrote a restud making exactly this point, that when we do this model, the beef of the model is outside. What I'm saying is the following. If you think of pledgeability and productivity, you start to think that maybe, oh, by the way, if you read the paper, one paragraph that is very important is that Ukraine had a growth miracle driven by export to Russia, right? There was this growth, trade, not trade growth. So maybe that is actually an interesting perspective, but it's really odd. So you need to reconstruct the Ukraine, but sort of in an export-led motive. And there are two reasons. First, get good technology. Second, exports are pledgeable more than a building in the middle of the Ukraine. So in a way, the trick of this strategy would be to have reconstruction, betting on a conversion to a new peacetime or whatever, post-war structure, which is export-led. The other part is that what is capital there? So they use various versions of the early 90s. One version that is actually, so they don't need to do it, but it could be good to keep in mind. There is also this Barrow paper. I wrote my dissertation on it, so I know by heart, in which you have capital, which is private capital and public capital. Now, public capital, there is an externality there, but this is exactly what is going on in the Ukraine. Now, you have an externality in the infrastructure. So, but once you say that, you start to think, how to finance it? So what, is it FDI? Is it public capital that you finance with fees? Or is it public capital you finance against future tax revenue? Okay, so you need that, but it changes a little bit the structure of the strategy that you do. And the second thing is that if you do a FDI for export, and rightly so, you try to push that investment through subsidy, you're going to have investment subsidy that goes to foreign-owned firms, which is an interesting topic. So there will be, in a way, a strategy looking at joint. So there must be some strategy that makes this politically palatable, right? To do this. And in the background, of course, there is a big sectoral model with rapid price dynamics. This capital inflow external adjustment can hardly be immaculate in the, like the immaculate current account adjustment. There will be lots of price movement there, which is going to be a big headache because, there is misalignment versus equilibrium prices. So I don't have to. So this is the end point. Like you want to do that strategy. The beginning is a pain because you have basically the cost of war. The cost of war, which almost unavoidable, we go to some that write down an extension or maybe extension. So again, remember, Ukrainians need resources and patience, that's for sure. So the extension could be a way out, independent of the mere success to do the, the Russian assets. There will be this trick. At the same time, you want to have extension, restructuring, and access to capital market, which is not an easy step. So I would say, when you open the hood of this paper, you get a sense that there is something to be written there about how you think of the policy regime, dynamic of the policy regime that allows you to do that. So even if you take that for granted, there is an issue of a roadmap. For example, capital controls, the papers say we need them for some time for many reasons, but for FDI, don't work. You need to have the repatriation of profits. So capital control must be evolving. More in general, there will be a capacity constraint on investment inflow. So this is what needs to be monitored. There is an issue of exchange rate adjustment versus misalignment, and there is an issue of liquidity arrangement. I don't think we can ask, we can expect Ukraine to have a 10% of reserve accumulation. It would be a little bit weird. No? So you need to have some kind of insurance for liquidity. The fiscal regime, you want the decline in VAT to encourage saving, maybe luxury VAT so that you don't hit the poor people. But what is the end point? Are you going towards income taxes? You see, what is the structure that would be good for the Ukraine? Having in mind that, in my view, it would be difficult to move out of an export-led model, which is, you see, if you think about this, a little bit, you need to reconstruct, but you need to do export-led. And I think that there is also something to think more about leveraging domestic international guarantees and value at risk. So there must be a way in which one can use aids or official lending as equity, right? To improve. This is something to think. And again, it's part of this. It could be time value. So I'm done with two arguments. So there is Oleg here. So disconnect. Which exchange rate would be good? So I write three lines missing in the paper, which is I look at all the Eastern European countries and the countries around the EA, and I redo the Baxter-Stockman exercise, so looking at the unconditional business cycle movement through some filtering to basically comparing floating and pegs. Now, remember the famous paper? There was basically no difference in the business cycle movement. The only difference was the volatility of the exchange rate. Here we have a volatility of the exchange rate here that is different. This thing here, or is that? Oops. Whatever. The first number, 2.5. Sorry, no, the exchange rate. What is the exchange rate? The 3.9 versus 0.8. But if you look at the business cycle, actually at the margin, I cannot say that there is no disconnect there, but at the margin, flexibility is helping. Flexibility is helping. So it is something to keep in mind. And also because there are lots of issues, reserves, speculative attack and whatever, but going for a fixed exchange rate, I think will be a strict jacket. This is just a small piece that I wanted to add. Now, final, this is a sketch by Michelangelo of the Last Judgment. This paper is like this, okay? So it could be great. It's a great sketch, but there is a lot of coloring. And also there is a lot of stuff around it that is missing. And I want to stress one problem that I have, which is there is very little talk about the change in international order. That makes me a little bit tense, because all the experience of the EU in the past, it's a different framework, it's a different regime. And coming back to my office, beautiful, they don't want to pay. I mean, the EU has a problem now. There is like a wind of politics that is contra. So, and also there is the US there. So what I'm saying is that it would be good to think maybe as a caveat or maybe as an addition to the strategy, what is the international context, the change in international context? How do we look at those numbers in the past, where the winds came from a totally different direction today. So I'm waiting for the color here, Yuriy.
On Michelangelo's painting. Great. Thank you, Giancarlo. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm delighted to be discussing this paper. As Giancarlo says, it's a pretty intense paper, and I got to do it very recently. So,
You really appreciate that. Thank you.
how do I say the calculus? Okay. Okay, so it's a very timely paper, as hopefully we can start thinking about the next life, which is not a done deal, but it's good to think about it. That's not mine. Okay, it's also a very careful paper. There is a lot of discussions of domestic conditions, and there are all these three different variants of the capital accumulation model that sort of serves as a strong framework. There is Giancarlo said it's a long paper, but that's what is good. There is a wealth of information of Ukraine and Eastern. There is a wealth of information about the economic history of Ukraine and Eastern Europe, which I found just by itself a very useful piece of work. If you want to have a quick crash course, go to the paper and you get it. That's very interesting. Now, as is clear, the paper is focusing on physical and human capital accumulation. So that's something that there are lots of papers which have come recently about, well, recently for the last 2-3 years about Ukraine reconstructions, about Ukraine development. Here, they put all their eggs in the same basket, which is a very useful thing to do because they push the argument to the end, and it's very useful. They also have an extensive survey of the literature on foreign aid. So again, if you want to know what is the state of understanding of foreign aid, it's in the paper, and just by itself, it's very useful to have. Then they have proposals which are based on their models, and it's already been discussed quite a bit by Gianfranco. I'm going to come back to that. And then one of the good things is that when they make recommendation, they spell out very transparently the assumption you need to reach the conclusion. Of course, the assumptions are assumptions, so you may get skeptical, but in that sense, it's also very useful. Now, so it's a very good article. Now, on the foreign aid, so there is this long discussion and survey of the literature, and my understanding from what they say is it's the verdict on the impact on the foreign aid on capital accumulation and growth is very unclear. And where the literature has been going is specifying conditions under which it's helpful and conditions on which it's not doing much or even negative. And what we get is that many of these conditions, I mean, first, there is a sort of virtuous or vicious circle. If you have the conditions right, then you'll get more foreign investment, and you'll have more growth, and that will help the institutions to adapt. And there is a vicious circle going the other way around. And the comparisons between, say, Poland and Czechia on the other side, and Ukraine and maybe Georgia, which is in not too different situation, is a way of thinking. If you get it right from early early on, then everything is going to come your way. If you get it wrong, you're swimming against water that's going to get you drowned. Now, the most of these conditions involve the institutional setup. Institution in a very broad sense, which includes regulations, law, property rights, politics, all of that, and it's also discussed in quite some detail. And when you read that, you said, well, that's not where Ukraine has been doing well at all. And then if you have this view of virtuous or vicious circle, you start getting a bit nervous, saying what is going to help. Now, Yuriy has already said EU and NATO membership, and I'll come back to that. So this magic wand. So again, here there is a very nice survey of how countries have fared relatively to EU and or NATO membership, and what they find is that actually you don't have to join really to get a big chunk of the benefits. It comes ahead of time. If it's going to happen, first it's going to have an impact on markets. Second, it can trigger foreign resources support. So that's the answer, I think, to the vicious circle, saying that's the crucial factor for Ukraine to get in the right way. Now, here you get nervous. The paper was probably written before the latest round of negotiations, but as I read what's going on, NATO membership is effectively ruled out. So there is a discussion about foreign troops on the ground, which would be a substitute, but even that is looking increasingly shaky. Now, things can change tomorrow morning depending on how the President of the United States has been sleeping last night. So it's extremely uncertain. But the fact that it is uncertain means that it is a sort of a weak hope to get on top of the virtual circle. Then the EU experience, it is much more likely that Ukraine will join the EU at some point. But when you look at the history of Ukraine, it's not either a magic wand. You had a number of countries that has fallen backward in many dimensions since they joined the EU, and I have a list here which can be debatable. Even Czechia now, which has been one of the success story, start turning a bizarre turn. So it's not automatic. It doesn't come, and you have countries like Romania or Bulgaria, which have arguably not been on a very virtuous circle. So that with all the previous stories means you get a little bit nervous about the solutions or the plans that they have in mind. Now. Okay. Now on capital accumulation, it's of course the first thing you get when you read the paper. At last, somebody's talking seriously about that, because the literature recently hasn't really emphasized that, at least to this point. So that's nice to start thinking seriously. And there is the emphasis on capital inflows, and especially FDI. So that's interesting. The argument is well developed. The argument of cross-fertilization between public and private spending is also a good thing to bring up. So all of that is good. Now, how reasonable it is, they come up with a computation of how much they need, and they say, well, let's say 40 billions, maybe. It's okay, assume 40 billions. Now, if you look at how much Europe has sent so far, if I'm right, they have sent since the beginning of the war something to the tune of 130, both military and non-military support. That's 0.6% of Europe annual GDP, and they send that over 3 years. So 40 billion per year is almost peanuts, or should be considered almost peanuts for the European, and that's when you start breathing more easily, saying, well, doable, very doable. Now, so that's to me it was a very strong conclusion, although the numbers are what they are, but that's a strong conclusion. Now, then the paper goes on to domestic saving, or the tax on consumption, and maybe some subsidies. So the models are standard growth model, and it's very nice. They introduce externalities one by one, and they always hit the ground with a consumption tax. Now, I got nervous there first, and there was already Yuriy mentioned the usual post-war boom in consumption. Can you avoid it? Both economically, people can spend, even if you raise a bit the value-added tax, unless you want to murder consumers, that's not going to block it. Then there is the question of the people returning. If you want them to come and you warn them that they will have a VAT, they might not return until the VAT has gone down, which is not what you want. So does it make sense realistically? Second, yeah, you should be careful about it for returnees. And then there is the sort of big issues I had from the paper, and I think Giancarlo touched upon that. They talk about externalities. They have a very elegant model by having very simple externalities, but we don't know how big they are. So there are distortions out there, and there are other distortions probably. Any tax is a distortion itself. So is there any justification for putting so much emphasis on a VAT, a smart VAT that's declining over time? There is no attempt to tell us what the numbers might be, and maybe you can't, but one is uncomfortable with reaching this conclusion just on the basis of the models, no matter how nice they are. Now I'm getting to the end. So I certainly know much less about the story than they do, but I had a number of questions that I wanted to share that are not mentioned. At least from reading every day's newspaper, I had the feeling that Ukraine has been enormously successful in terms of developing new technology, weaponry, and producing them in quantity, because we were not sending enough. So there has been a rapid accumulation of physical and human capital in these particular industries. What does it mean? Can they retool quickly? Do they have an international comparative advantage? So if there's going to be export-led growth, is this what they would do? And if that they would do, presumably foreign investment would come easily. The arm business is one of the most lucrative business. So is it something that the Ukraine of the future? Then there is a little bit of talk about corruption in the paper, but the words corruption and Ukraine tend to come often together. And although Yuriy said there has been enormous progress, if you have billions euros or dollars that keep coming year after year is very hard in any country. In the cleanest country, it's very hard to prevent corruption. And is this something that creates a new vicious circle? Then there is I think, a big question, which they mentioned briefly. The Ukraine emerges or will emerge from the war with a very high public debt, most of which is external, a big chunk of which is external, including to IMF and other donors. And they correctly say that there will be a need for restructuring. There is no way Ukraine can do all of the things they would like to see without restructuring, but they don't discuss it. It's a sort of capital inflow, and it would be nice to have a little bit more meat on what can be done, and also the relationship between restructuring and capital inflows, because the two of them at the end of the day are the same thing. So how do you think it's nice to proceed with? And finally, so a few suggestions. You need to strengthen and make more convincing the case for a consumption tax. It's sort of coming from the models, but the models have been built to get there in a way. And I would like to have more emphasis on what is specific about Ukraine and what it means in terms of attracting industries in the ability to manage large flows. You talked about the financial market, but you should relate that. I mean, it would help to relate that to capital inflows. The role of expatriates that are not returning. So are these guys going to start sending more money than they've done in the past? Is there anything to be done about that? And yes, and that's mentioned very much in the paper as one source of the problems of Ukraine in the past, is that it was not perceived as safe because of the threat of Russia. So people were not sending money, not investing in Ukraine. Is the likely peace plan going to make Ukraine safe? We don't have the answer, but it would be important, I think, if you could mention that. I mean, get more of the Ukraine view. Thank you very much. Sorry if it's been too long.
Thank you very much. Yes, please put your things for questions. Let's start with Olivier.
So you compared what could happen to what happened earlier in the transition from central planning. But it seems to me the paper would be more interesting if you compared it to reconstruction in Europe after World War II. And there are a lot of similarities, and there are numbers to look at. So France, for example, was a country which had done very poorly before the war, just like Ukraine, and then actually grew very fast from the end of the war on. So looking at what happened to consumption versus investment, what happened to FDI, there was a burst of productivity growth, TFP growth, which came from the fact that old capital was replaced by new capital with new technology, which seems important. There was a burst of growth coming from the reconstruction of bridges, for example, public capital. It seems to me that the numbers are there. It would be useful to just compare. And I think it would strengthen your case that good things can happen. I think the level of destruction of France was less, probably in terms of private capital, than it was when it is in Ukraine. That might be worth looking. There's a paper by Gilles Saint-Paul on that, which you may want to look at.
Thank you, Oleg.
So I had overflow question from yesterday's panel, but it's related to this. So there is something odd with numbers, and the investment don't look too large. The GDP looks too small, right? And so the question I had is it the price of investment goods relative to some PPP adjustment that you need 3 times the GDP for reconstruction, right? It's just a huge ratio where we would think like the share of total capital to GDP is typically of those orders of magnitude. So why so much capital is needed? I guess it's an international price. A lot of these investments are in international prices of investment goods and construction goods, and GDP is artificially too small in dollars because of the PPP adjustment or something like. So I was wondering what you thought about these numbers. More substantively, when you emphasize kind of growth strategies that rely on suppression of consumption, those things typically come together with suppression of wages, right? And then actually in a lot of development episodes, it's not obvious what goes first, suppression of consumption or suppression of the labor market. And so like if you think about Asian growth miracles, right, this was very natural because you have a captive large labor force. Of course, these strategies don't work when labor force is small, and you need actually to attract workers because then you need wages, and wages come together with consumption. Alternatively, and this goes back to Giancarlo's question, right? Like this works well also if it's an export growth-led thing where you don't really need domestic consumption based and low wages help you with like export profits and so entry of firms. But it's not actually obvious whether in the modern world, unlike in like 20th century growth miracles, you can rely so much on export growth miracles or you actually need domestic consumption based. And then, so kind of it comes with a lot of trade-offs, right? Basically, suppressed consumption, suppressed wages might be actually difficult for a growth strategy in the 21st century. So I'm kind of curious what you think about that.
Elena?
I have a question and comment about German car manufacturing. It will make sense in a second. If you could break up the period of 2014 onwards, and you talked a bit about corruption there, but let's not forget you had a massive pivot away from Russia towards European Union, alignment of standards, and at some point, I think it's 2016, 17, 18, you actually had to ferry people by bus to factories in the western part of Ukraine, or also German, manufacturing, because you didn't have enough labor. So you actually had a massive, sort of by local standards, a big important pickup in foreign direct investment into Ukraine. And it was almost it almost was beginning to pick up, and there was thinking you could replicate the experience of Central Eastern European countries in Ukraine, but cheaper labor, right? And of course, then the war started again, and then COVID, and then the war. And Russia is actually, I think, was also smart in terms of starting the war when it started, because there was a risk of Ukraine running away, and also because of the alignment with European Union, you had the sort of better exports elsewhere as well. But now the question is, the German car manufacturer is no more, right? So there's no point of replicating Poland of 20 years ago. So what is that future? And related to that, on defense, you also talk about the capital, sort of stronger capital markets. But if you look at the defense financing, you actually have a lot of civil society sort of participation, as well as medium-sized and big investment funds. So how can we use that to channel it back to the sort of mainstream capital markets? And of course, integration, and Maurice is sitting here also, with European defense manufacturing skills and whatnot. That's it.
Thank you, Iran.
Thanks. I thought it was a great paper, but something looks missing, and that is labor and immigration. You mentioned something like 9 million refugees, that you'll attract them by higher wages through capital deepening. But what do we know about possible dynamics? For example, if the war goes on or the Trump Accord is bad, people don't come back for a few years. There is perhaps more emigration. All the dynamics of emigration and immigration could be crucial. And as you simulate other things, maybe you'd like to simulate this as well. There are many other examples. A recent example is the Syrian economy, which was totally destroyed by war, by civil war for years. And there was huge refugee emigration, and they don't come back. And closer to home, if you like, 5% of Greece's population left it in 2010, 2012. They didn't come back, and they're not probably going to come back.
Fabrizio?
Yeah, enjoy really. The paper is a great presentation, great discussion. I have two questions. One, I like the first picture in which you saw Ukraine at the beginning, was like one of the richest and then goes way down. It was fascinating. But I was trying to run a graph in my head. How important is distance from Moscow in determining the fate of this country? And if distance from Moscow is an important thing, it's not so obvious that isn't much you can do about it. I mean, and maybe the first thing you should deal with Moscow in some way or another, and that's a precondition for getting capital in. And the second one is human capital. You guys haven't thought about it, and of course, human capital is less pledgeable than physical capital. But on the other hand, human capital is like capital complementarity. If you build like very skilled labor force, that's a way to get the capital in. Because I mean, you're talking 20 billion, 40 billions. That stuff is peanuts. If you look at the MB, the capital will come if there is conditions. So it's more important than thinking the VAT. I don't know if this VAT is like getting the condition for capital, private capital to come, and human capital maybe as important. I'm wondering your thoughts about that.
Okay, a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Terrifically interesting, but it's a one sector model. And I wonder whether you need, of course, I will say this, something like, and it's simple and elegant and clear, but you can do the three sector Australian model, been central to all sorts of World Bank modeling of development strategies, importables, exportables, and non-tradables. Is it non-tradables or is it development reconstruction goods? Some kind of categorization that way. And my second point that relates to external and internal balance. Again, in a way, the Trevor Swan Australian story. People have talked about export-led growth. Do you mean to sustain a market when you say export-led growth? But here we've got too big a market with a VAT. So that's a contradiction which these comments make to what you're saying, and you know, need to either see off that comment or agree with it, or is the exports because it's the external constraint, and you need exports in order to make the numbers add up with only 40 billion coming from capital inflow. So you can see that both on the demand side and the supply side, disaggregating to more than one commodity might help you answer structural questions. And of course, the minute I do different sectors, the question is which different sectors, what actual sectors will do importables, non-tradables, exportables, and the work that we heard yesterday about the labour markets and industrial knowledge suggests you'll be able to get that. You've already done a huge project, and this I'm just mapping out one much larger again, but I think this would be helpful.
Okay, so one final question from me. Excellent paper. I would like to go back to a little bit this key message came from your discussants and audience, thinking this more in open economy, in a integrated to European trade and European financial markets, so we don't have to limit consumption and kind of delink the timing of capital accumulation from consumption. And of course, the example country here would be Turkey. I mean, Turkey did exactly the huge FDI investment because of the EU membership without becoming an EU member, right? Just starting the talk, just making Turkey an accession country in 2004 is just astronomical FDI coming into the country, and with only one-sided custom union with Europe. So, and no suppressing consumption, no tax, no nothing. And yes, of course, NATO membership there, but it didn't have becoming a member to NATO. So the safety is a piece here, but I would like to get your views on that. Goes back also what Maurice said. If maybe other conditions are also right, you're also going to get the private capital coming in, which will of course then solve your suppressing the consumption problem. Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay, I will start and try to answer as many as I can and leave others to Yuriy to pick up. First of all, thanks to Giancarlo and Charles for two really great discussions. I mean, we kind of view this paper as sort of an aspirational paper in the sense that clearly the objective facts on the ground are bad and they're getting worse. And so, I think we, after the famous Oval Office meeting between Zelensky and the Trump administration, Yuriy proposed the Plan B for Ukraine, And now we may be on the plan C for Ukraine. And I'm not really sure, frankly, what the plan C is. Probably a very scaled down version of this with much less chances of success. But we thought it was useful anyway, especially when we started this project, to sketch out, what we thought would be really important in putting Ukraine on the kind of path that other Eastern European countries have been on. And frankly, the continuation of the current posture from the US and the current inability of Europe to get its act together, rather than lifting Ukraine, is going to push the rest of Eastern Europe more toward Ukraine. So I think this is something we may have to worry about in future economic policy panels. So on some specific points that Giancarlo raised, I can't cover everything. There were a lot of great suggestions, and also David kind of raised this. Are we thinking of exports as being a good in themselves, or really an adjunct to consumption suppression? I think they are complementary. If you suppress consumption, you'll export more. And while we don't explore this in the paper, there's considerable evidence of firms learning by exporting. There are very strong externalities there. And that would be an additional argument for the kind of mechanisms that we are talking about. We don't really differentiate between public capital and private capital. And Giancarlo is surely right that, public investment in infrastructure is going to play a huge role in a post-war Ukraine, if we ever get to a post-war Ukraine. There's evidence of externalities from that type of investment, of course, which is why it tends to be a public good investment that the government undertakes. And again, I think that's a further argument for the kind of approach we take, that if we can buttress domestic saving, make more capital available, that's going to be a plus. Both Charles and Giancarlo asked about restructuring and access to capital markets. I would view them, I think Yuriy would agree, as complementary, particularly if we're restructuring public loans, which, according to the IMF, to put Ukraine on a fiscally sustainable path, there will have to be deep restructuring of existing public loans. The private sector credit has been partially restructured, not completely, but the real money is in official bilateral creditors extending maturities or outright forgiving loans. And there's no question, I think, based on theory and evidence, that this is only going to be positive for capital inflows. You look at Greece today, you look at the difficulties in Argentina. If they had restructured a long time ago, they might be on a somewhat better footing. The debt overhang is a real problem. It's a theoretical problem, and it's a real problem. And there's a famous quote from Roy Harrod in the 1950s saying that with respect to investors, they're not so much worried about the past, but about future prospects. And if you get rid of an overhang, that'll only improve matters. There are a lot of issues we didn't get into. You could indeed write a book or an entire new CEPR report on all the aspects in detail of what Ukraine will need. Certainly on the exchange rate regime, a flexible exchange rate is clearly the way to go. And accumulating more reserves would be good. You're not going to be able to do that if you're pegging your exchange rate, drawing a line in the sand. And I think the current experience of Argentina sort of indicates what the perils are of that. Charles, thank you for your remarks about our survey of foreign aid. But one of the, I think two of the big findings from that literature are, number one, that the effectiveness of foreign aid or foreign capital inflows more generally really depends on the institutional setting and high institutional quality. And Shebnem has done a lot of work on this. It's a big literature. If you don't condition on those variables, you can't really find a positive effect of foreign aid in the literature. And another aspect of the literature is that consumption booms are really bad. Almost any optimal growth model you write down will indicate that foreign aid is largely consumed when it comes in. And historically, this has been really bad for the success of the liberalization program. For one thing, you get real appreciation. Real appreciation takes resources away from the tradable goods sector. This is getting to David's Australian model. That is a source of productivity growth. And again, that's not in our models, but it's something that I think in the empirical record is very strong. Charles is absolutely right that there is a kind of virtuous or vicious circle, self-reinforcing mechanisms in thinking about the institutional setup. Clearly, Ukraine currently and historically has had huge problems in terms of state capacity. The hope is that the experience of having lived twice, second time looking death in the face, really moves the political equilibrium in Ukraine. Perhaps we're seeing evidence of this in the recent anti-corruption measures. It's been an ongoing issue. Corruption is deeply entrenched in the political system, in the culture, unless it's to a large extent rooted out. Ukraine is not going to make it. It's clear you won't have FDI. The FDI that comes won't be productive. And for FDI to come in, there will definitely have to be some sort of credible security guarantee. And there's no pretending in the paper that without security, FDI is going to come in. It just is not going to happen. So that's something that may not happen. The facts on the ground are moving very quickly. If the war continues with the level of bombing that is currently going on, whatever we say in the paper is moot. But I don't think that undermines the need to discuss what could happen, what should happen in a virtuous scenario. Charles made the good point that a VAT could discourage returnees. The model we have in mind would be having returnees, facing a sunk cost of returning and focusing on the future path of wages, which is going to be higher if more people return, if more capital is invested. Giancarlo raised a very good point about the steady state versus the transition. In some of our models, the steady state is different because of a subsidy. You asked if a subsidy to foreign investment would be politically viable. Part of the mechanism we would envision would subsidize saving and domestic investment indirectly. But it's also the case, one could go more into detail, that subsidies to foreign investment have been politically viable in other Eastern European experiences. Poland did very well with tax-free zones for foreign investment. So that's something else that could be explored in the model. Okay, I'll see if Yuriy has any other. What's that?
About geography, it's a great question, but there are some counterexamples that at least give hope to me. You look at South Korea, it's a similar situation. You have a crazy aggressive neighbor to the north, and somehow you're able to develop and become a very successful country The Baltic countries are even closer to Moscow. Somehow they managed to become members of NATO, EU. They're very successful in many ways. So Ukraine, maybe equally bad or equally good. It depends on how you take on this. In terms of, German car industry, it's a great question. The idea, one possibility here is that the defense sector in Europe is going to be the next growth point. And to the extent Ukraine is going to be a part of the European defense perimeter, one may expect that lots and lots of contracts, funding is going to come through this channel towards Ukrainian startups that can scale up, become more productive, more successful at the European scale. Oleg had a question about investment. I think, just a question of very low levels of investment. You look at investment to GDP ratio, the national income product accounts, it's only 10%. It's very, very low. That's why we had so much deaccumulation of capital. We need to raise it to at least 15, 20% to have a growth trajectory. And Olivier had a comment about France after World War II. It's a great idea. We should do something like that. Thank you.
Oh yeah, that reminds me two other points. Distance to Moscow. If you look at our data, you find that a relatively successful country compared to Ukraine, at least in terms of GDP per capita, is Belarus. And that's because of their distance to Moscow. Politically, Moscow has hugely supported them. And they've cooperated politically. And part of Ukraine's problem has been it's been neither here nor there. And now it is trying to make a turn to the West, which would be a good thing. And I want to underscore Olivier's comment, actually. If you read, for example, Barry Eichengreen's history of Western Europe, post-war Western Europe, one of the big drivers of growth was very high investment, or firms plowing profits back into investment. And I think that sort of supports the investment-led narrative. Also, wages were relatively low, and that was socially acceptable because of this sort of social compact between workers and firms. In Ukraine, which needs to attract people back from abroad, that might not be quite as possible.
Linda?
Yeah, just really nice, thoughtful work. I just wanted to kind of follow up on the defense sector as a growth opportunity. I wonder how investing in and expanding that sector for Ukraine interacts with the whole security, kind of how secure Ukraine will be in the future. So in a way, in a dynamic sense, you would expect if this was a manufacturing base for defense products, then it's more of an incentive for it to be protected by Europe, but there's more of an incentive as well to take out that it's a point of vulnerability, so more of an incentive for Russia to actually come in and take out Ukraine again in the future. So it's an interesting dynamic that it could also set up vis-a-vis security going forward.
And I think the Ukrainian defense sector has been one of the most hopeful developments from the war, the technical progress that has really changed the nature of warfare, going forward for everyone. I think this sector is critical for Europe's future defense. And, history shows that defense research has huge spillovers to the rest of the economy. So that's a really hopeful sign.
It's true. If you look at how defense industry operates in Germany or the US, it's very concentrated geographically. But one big lesson from Ukraine was to decentralize this as much as possible. So it's very hard to hit a production facility because it's not one facility, it's thousands of places. And if you have something like this, it's true you don't have perfect security, but it's also not clear that you have an ability to knock off the sector in one strike or something like that. And also, we already see a lot of cooperation being done today. For example, a lot of Danish money is flowing into Ukraine to support the production of drones, missiles, and so on. Some of the technological transfer is flowing the other way, in the sense that Ukraine gives its know-how to the UK, to Denmark, to other countries to teach them, how you operate in this new warfare. So in many ways, it's already a win-win situation, and you can expect it's going to be even more important going forward. Another thing I wanted to mention very briefly is that a lot of defense sector is now kind of shifted to a new level where you focus on AI and things like this. Something that was never, a big deal before. And for example, if you want to have successful drones and you want to have some type of AI that is going to operate them, you have to have a lot of, training sample, basically video feeds from, successful or unsuccessful strikes. And Ukraine, maybe Russia, is the only country that, have this kind of access. So if you want to have a successful technology, you have to rely on know-how from Ukraine. And, maybe one thing which occurred to me just now when Charles was saying, about NATO and everything. If you think about where we have the strongest military industrial complex now in Europe, it will be two countries, Russia and Ukraine. So if somehow Ukraine becomes a failed state and becomes a part of Russia, you can imagine then you have a really big industrial complex, military industrial complex. And I'm not sure Europe is, ready or in any position to really counter this might from the combined countries.
Great. So this all goes back to Europe getting its act together and developing the industrial military complex. All right. Okay. We are moving to next paper. So a couple minutes break so people get coffees and drinks and all that while Ed is setting up, or Andrii, who is presenting? You're all present. Okay. Why don't you guys all come up here then? Thank you. Thank you. Discussants and the
Yuriy, I'm sorry we had to go out for our interview during your day, but we talked.
I look forward to your, recording.
I took your thing. I don't mind if you're. Yeah. So we could.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure, whatever is easy.
Need some space. I got rid of the photos.
Oh, yeah.
I only had one slide.
All right, let's go back to our seats. Do you want to do the time on these people?
If you can do it.
All right, okay.
Yeah. You are doing the fact. Well, okay. I think yeah, we're very happy. Unless I'm mistaken. Yeah.
All right, we are starting. So the next paper and the final paper of the conference. Rebuilding Ukraine cities, maximizing benefits and minimizing costs. And Ed Glaeser is presenting. People, take your seats. You're all presenting. Okay, all right.
It's wonderful to be here. I can't imagine a place that I'd rather be than here talking about this topic with you. I think we're trying to answer two primary questions here, although there are certainly more than two questions that need to be answered about how to rebuild Ukraine. The first is sort of where, like the natural instinct after a disaster of this form is to want to recreate what was lost, right? And I have these images. This is Central City Warsaw, where it was sort of like a museum piece that was sort of perfectly recreated. And yet it is often unwise to try to create what was lost. Now, to be clear, right, like we think the bulk of choices about where people live, about what happens, should be made by those people. It shouldn't be planned from the top down. But there needs to be some decisions about where infrastructure is going to be put going forward, and there has to be some sense about where. And so Andrei's presentation is going to be focused on a sort of simple model that helps us think about investing in the East versus investing in the West. Right, where there's very much going to be a trade-off between sort of the equity considerations, and we're not going to model the national security considerations, which might push you to the East, versus the very strong productivity considerations, which push you towards the West. The second question that we're not going to say anything about formally is about which sectors to prioritize first. So in the wake of World War II, Ukraine was very industry heavy in terms of what it was rebuilt. Stalin wanted it that way, right? We're not going to be saying very much. Obviously, there's always sort of a presupposition that infrastructure should come before other things. I think another point which is really vital to make is that you never should think that you're planning for permanence. Right, that often you want to be thinking about, what's right for the next 10 years, not necessarily what's right for the next 50. The third thing we're going to be focused on, or the second thing we're going to be focused on, is what choices can be reduce the cost of reconstruction, and that's going to be the focus of Martina's presentation. Procurement is about 15% of global GDP, and it's deeply understudied. Institutional design matters, rules matter, mass production matters. This fact that an average bus in the US, average electric bus costs $1.05 million as paid for by a transit agency. You can buy a perfectly nice 36-foot electric bus from Hyundai for $350,000. So it's a threefold difference because of the way that we handle procurement on buses. This is from a paper of mine with Simon and Andrii. In general, sort of having lots of rules around procurement tends to be beneficial in low human capital countries and weak institutional environments because you constrain the corruption. In high institutional capacity environments like Singapore, rules are bad. You want to just have your people, let them go. Okay, 5 facts about Ukraine cities prior to the invasion. First of all, well, even before this fact, first thing to remember is Ukraine is a very there is an urban colossus, right? Kiev bestrides the nation. Andrei's estimates are GDP per capita is 4 times higher in Kiev than it is elsewhere, right? And so you have Ukraine, you have Kiev, and you have much of the country which feels like the American Rust Belt other than that, okay? And population decline, so at its heights in the 1990s, population was over 50 million. It was 45 million in 2010, it was 41 million at the wake of the war. Now it's 34 million. So, you have the steady decline in population. You have a particular population in the decline in the east, right? So there's a steady move from east to west. You can see that in general, there's not much evidence of mean reversion. And of course, Kiev is an urban superstar. It's the sort of one big urban area that's actually growing over this entire time period. These are changes in population, residential construction, housing prices, housing rents. You can see it's, the east to west pattern is huge. Okay. And in all of these things, the demand is in the west, the east feels like Detroit in lots of ways. Most of my work post-conflict has actually been on rebuilding Kharkiv, which is both an amazing city with an amazing past, but obviously one that is beset with amazing headwinds. Okay, wait, go back. Last fact. Okay, housing prices. Okay. No, sorry. Go. Okay, 4. Housing prices, like, as opposed to much of my work in the US, which is obsessed with the high cost of American housing, this is not a problem in Ukraine. So let's feel good about that one. But obviously there is heterogeneity. I mean, Kiev is much more expensive than the East. Again, this is the sort of Rust Belt feature of this. And the last fact is that there are, it's not as if the cities are functioning very well in terms of their mobility levels. They're cities that were built for sort of old style Soviet public transportation. Demand has often been for automobile-based mobility, and the cities are not really built to accommodate that. That would require a massive change to enable that to happen. These are sort of the global rankings in terms of congestion. Kiev ranks 36 in the world. That's quite impressive in terms of how slow things are. Uncongested speeds are quite low. Speeds are quite low, and so this is a challenge going forward. Good. Okay, over to you, Andrii.
Okay, so next we will take into account this evidence and we will build a simple spatial model of Ukraine. And that's going to be a static model where we'll have 25 locations represented by oblasts, which is a name of regions in Ukraine. And there will be one outside location, which is a representative, a broad location where people could potentially move from Ukraine, or people can move from there to Ukraine in a contrafactual. And we will exclude Crimea and the occupied parts of Donbass before 2022. We don't know what will happen to those areas in the future, but our baseline scenario in our spatial equilibrium analysis will be the border right before the invasion. Okay, so locations will be differentiated by the level of amenities, which represent how nice the location it is to live there. There will be some wages paid to people who live and work in this location, and there will be differences in housing costs. And so far, this has been standard. One tweak that we make to an otherwise standard spatial equilibrium model is that we have 2 types of infrastructure. There is producer-related infrastructure, and it will affect how productive a given location is. And there is a consumer-related infrastructure, which will affect the amenity level of locations. And these 2 components will be important because the way that we will model the destruction during the war will be the destruction of these 2 types of infrastructure. Okay, so the household problem is very simple. People consume non-housing goods and housing. They have Cobb-Douglas utility in these 2 components. We have an extension in the paper with Stone-Geary preferences in which there is a minimum housing requirement. And they maximize utility subject to a standard budget constraint. And the indirect utility tells us how people choose locations. So when they choose where to live, they want places with the highest amenities, highest wages, and lowest housing costs. Also, when they make the choice of where to live, this choice is going to have 2 stages. First, they choose whether to live in Ukraine or not. And that's going to be an important choice in our war scenario, where a lot of people would choose not to live in Ukraine. There is a preference shock that defines the elasticity of outflows from Ukraine. And once they chose to live in Ukraine, they also choose which region of Ukraine to live in. And there's also a preference shock associated with that. And in equilibrium, we obtain that the population of a given oblast is going to be proportional to the utility of living in that oblast. And the population of Ukraine in general is going to be defined by how nice, on average, Ukraine is to live in, which is going to go down in our war scenario, and also on the outside utility of living outside of Ukraine. Okay, so we also have a simple firm structure. We have firms that produce a homogeneous traded good. They produce using a Cobb-Douglas technology. This determines local wages. And then we have a decreasing returns to scale housing supply production function, and this determines equilibrium prices of housing. We calibrate the model using some parameters from the literature. We have some Ukraine-specific parameters, such as labor share in production, real interest rates, and the last two parameters are important for our counterfactuals because they determine how elastic is labor supply in Ukraine. So labor supply in Ukraine is relatively inelastic, so people don't want to leave Ukraine, all else equal, but they are more flexible in terms of where in Ukraine they want to live. Okay, so let's now talk about how. So we have a calibration of Ukraine to the year of 2020-21, right before the invasion, and then when we model invasion, we will try to think about Ukraine's economy in 2024 because that will be the recent data that we have. So what happens in 2024? We model the war as the destruction of producer-related capital and consumer-related capital. And so you basically can think about both types of capital decreasing by fraction eta. So this fraction eta will be taken by satellite imagery collected by Scher and Van den Hoek, who shared the data with us. And this is the rate of destruction that we get from them. So there is some destruction in every region of Ukraine, but there is more destruction in the south and the east, as you would expect. So what happens? So basically, the way that you should understand this is the two types of infrastructure go down, and locations where there is more destruction, they become less attractive to live in because amenities go down. They also become worse places to work in because productivity goes down and therefore wages go down. And the way that wages go down is also going to be exacerbated by agglomeration externalities, which we have in the model. Okay, so here are some baseline results. There is a 15% drop in population. This is targeted. So that's exactly by how much population has declined. There is an 18% decline in output. We underpredict this a bit. So by 2024, actual output fell by 23%. We are close, but not exactly there. There's also a decline in productivity, and there is a 7% reduction in welfare. And obviously, our measure of welfare doesn't include other costs of war. So this is a huge underestimate, of course, but welfare coming specifically from the destruction of productive infrastructure and consumer infrastructure is this is the number that we get from there. Okay, so this is what our model predicts for the distribution of population and the distribution of house prices and productivity and amenities. And the big picture that you see is that there are huge declines in the south and the east, and other regions are less affected. We can validate the model with the actual data from 2021 to 2024. And our model, even though we don't target regional changes in population and regional changes in house prices, our model does pretty well in predicting them. One thing that we are missing is the level of changes in house prices. So our model has endogenous housing supply, meaning that, and we do that because we also want to think about long-run counterfactuals where housing supply can be provided. There wasn't a lot of construction from 2021 to 2024, so you can think about fixed housing stock. And we do well on the distribution, but we underpredict the fact that house prices actually went up in many regions of Ukraine. Okay, so the last part of the model exercise will be to think about optimal reconstruction policy. So for this, we will consider a benevolent planner who has access to some amount of reconstruction funds and can use these funds to rebuild some of the infrastructure that was destroyed during the war. And we will not think about the quantity of reconstruction. So we will think about the first order perturbation approach, where we basically increase infrastructure by a little bit in every location and look at the marginal benefit of providing funds in every given region of Ukraine. Here's what we find from an exercise where the planner wants to maximize national welfare. So here, every number for a region will mean by how much national Ukrainian welfare will increase if I provide infrastructure funding in this particular region. So what do we find here? We find that investing in southern and eastern regions, which were the most heavily affected, actually doesn't produce a lot of welfare benefits. It makes more sense to invest in some western regions, especially the Lviv region, in Kiev, and some central regions as well. And another result that we find here is that the marginal benefits of investing in producer infrastructure are substantially larger than investing in consumer infrastructure. Then we do another exercise. So what if the planner does not care about national welfare? What if we have 25 regional planners who all want to maximize their local welfare? In this case, of course, we get a result that it makes sense to rebuild in the east and the south, because that's where we see a lot of destruction. And the difference between these two results highlights the equity efficiency trade-off, right? So if you think from the national perspective, we find that it's optimal to spend a lot of money in places where people already moved, places that are more productive, places that have higher amenities. So basically, money should be spent in a way that sustains the changes in the spatial equilibrium that already happened as people vote with their feet and move to the west and to Kiev. However, if we think about strategic considerations such as having some population close to the border with Russia, close to the east, then we may find very different results in terms of where to rebuild. Okay, so let me conclude what we find from the model exercise. Optimal reconstruction policy, according to our model, prioritizes spending in oblasts with high productivity and amenities, places where people moved. We find that agglomeration effects matter. For example, it's optimal to invest in Kiev, but if we didn't have agglomeration effects in the model, the optimality of investing in Kiev would be lower. As I already mentioned, there is an equity efficiency trade-off. From the national perspective, it makes sense to invest in the West. From the local perspective, it does not make sense to do that. We don't consider symbolic and strategical reasons to invest more in the East and South. That's outside of the scope of our model. And the fact that we find larger marginal benefits of investing in producer infrastructure versus consumer suggests something about the order of priorities, right? If we have to choose what to rebuild first, our model will suggest that we should rebuild first the infrastructure that allows the economy to function, and then rebuild things that make cities nice to live in.
Great. So in this final part, I will now talk about the reconstruction cost curve. So the elasticity of supply in the construction sector is going to determine how much this upscaling of construction activity is translating into higher prices. And the way we think about the cost of an individual project is it's captured or tracked by markups and then inputs into the production of this project. So wages, material costs, and equipment costs. Now, markups can be reduced by a more competitive environment, partially due to more competitive procurement or more standardized products. And then there are additional cost shifters, use of more efficient firms or better supporting infrastructure. And what we're discussing in the paper are sort of three broad strategies that are openness, standardization, and investing in investing. With openness, we refer to making more firms and workers available. Standardization refers to making products in a sector that's just characterized by extremely large heterogeneity of its products, more standardized where this is possible. And then investing in investing refers to this literature that was developed in the context of resource-rich countries that are capital scarce. And we think of investments that should and could be taken before the scaling up of investment happens. So the price level, these are price level estimates for Ukraine compared to upper middle income countries in construction sector before the conflict, and it was much lower. So overall price levels in construction are 30 to 60% lower compared to upper middle income countries. Now we can also compare this to lower middle income countries, and they're still lower as Ukraine was moved in 2024 across these categories. The war had a severe effect on the construction sector in a number of dimensions. So first, a shortage of workers, partially due to the military draft and people leaving the country. There were damages Some of the damages were strategic, as these facilities, producers of inputs, were targeted in the attacks. That needed reorganization of supply chains. Some key inputs, for example, sheet glass, used to be imported from Russia. That needs to be rerouted now. And then there are particular inputs that constrain production and the availability of, and that's electricity. And I'll talk more about why that's particularly key for this sector. Now, there was a contraction of construction output, 37% in new housing construction, 42% drop in civil construction, and a 26% drop in transport infrastructure construction. A clear way of how to reduce costs is by ending the conflict. And this is a paper that I wrote a while ago that shows conflict and corrupt countries have much higher unit costs of road construction. Now, who is going to be doing this reconstruction efforts and who are the firms? So if we look at the industrial organization, it looks very similar to other countries. There are lots of small firms. So 80% of firms have 10 people or less. 3.2% are medium-sized, and there are only 7 firms that had more than 250 people. What I show you in the table is work that I'm doing with Andy Bernard and Michael Peters on thinking about cross-border flows in the construction industry. And so I show you for each year here the number of firms from a list of global contractors. So these are the top 225 to 250 global contractors in the construction industry. And they're ranked by their international revenue, their total international revenue. And you can see the average rank of these contractors in 2005 was 71. The top ranked was 1. So the top contractor was working in Ukraine, and they come from 8 countries, which are listed there. You can see in 2010 that number is 19. If we go forward to 2024, that number has halved to 10. So there are 10 global contractors. The average rank has risen dramatically from 71 to 139. This means that there are smaller firms that are operating there now. The top rank is lower too, it's 19. So whereas in all of these previous years that I show you, there is one of the top global 5 contractors working. Now the top comes from the top rank is 19, and the number of countries has shrunk too. So these firms come from 3 countries now. But this also says there's experience historically of these top contractors working there. Now, let's go to materials. So construction is a huge user of intermediate inputs, and it's clear that these distortions that are upstream in the production of capital have implications through input-output linkages on output. This is particularly important for largely non-tradable inputs, such as what we have in mind here is cement, sand, or gravel. I'll show you more on cement in a moment. Now, good news is that Ukraine has very strong domestic production capacity. So it can produce about 80% of inputs domestically. The key upstream constraint, and that's from a survey of material producers and industry associations, is electricity. Electricity is key to produce a lot of these inputs, as some, for example, if you produce cement, the kiln will be powered by fuel, but a lot of the conveyor belts, the kiln rotation, the grinding and crushing of the stones needs to be done powered by electricity. And so electricity is key for factories to operate at all and to avoid damages to the equipment. And that's irrespective of what level of capacity these firms operate. And there's substantial damage to capacity in several sectors. So this shows you the cement plants that are there. We had a drop of 35% due to plants being damaged. This is this plant here, the Balsam plant, mothballed. This is the Kramatorsk plant, the one in the middle, and then to the right, the Amrozivka plant is in the occupied territories. You can see I've listed here the ownership of these plants. So currently there are 3 players in the cement market and anti-dumping duties. Now, if we think about labor, and that ties, I think, to what we heard yesterday nicely, the construction sector is characterized by decline in employment. So here you can see employment dropped from about 8% of the population to 4% of the population. And then wages, this is since the 1990s, and then wages here, if you sit in the back, this is from 2019 to 2024. And I'm plotting them here relative to the average wage. So this is average monthly salaries. You can see here the construction sector. Here is the one at the very bottom. It's lower even than agriculture in terms of the wages. Now, clearly this masks a lot of heterogeneity. The type of workers and skill sets that are used for different parts of the construction process are very different. But on average, it's a very lowly ranked sector. So what do these three strategies mean? Openness refers to increasing firms and workers, and these could be domestic or coming from outside contractors. Given the structure of the domestic industry, it looks implausible that these firms can produce all of the big infrastructure projects that are likely needed. Standardization refers to specific products that can be standardized, and we talk about this more in the paper. For example, electric panels. Regulation can help with standardization, for example, simplifying building codes across space or also zoning types. And there's a role here for modular and prefab buildings that we talk about more in the paper, or precast elements, where we think that the location choices might not be permanent. Using some of these solutions that are somewhat more temporary and can be produced at scale can be really important. They also reduce the skills requirement as these processes are more harmonized. And then third, investing are the physical inputs and the infrastructure that needs to be in place for the capital scale up to be able to take place. So that could also take the form of vocational training investments that countries could, that the Ukraine could do in conjunction with educational institutions and building contractors, perhaps talking to global contractors about the skills that are going to be needed. And these are the investments that can be taking place in advance to spread skills throughout the population that will be needed going forward. And that includes institutional reforms such as labor market reforms as well. Now, to conclude, I want to say two more things. One on the geography of procurement efficiency. So here, as Ed was saying, procurement is central to reconstruction cost curve, and it impacts everything from markups to material costs. Ukraine implemented e-procurement in 2016. So here we use some data from 2019 for all the reconstruction related categories in procurement. And on the left, we're showing you cost savings. So that's the difference between the estimated cost and the actual cost. And the right, the number of bidders. And you can see that if anything, this will strengthen the argument that Andrii made in his presentation of higher cost savings in the Western region. So this is one way to think about the geography of costs, and going forward, maybe also to identify bottlenecks. Finally, one comment on the institutions for rebuilding. One vision could be to have a tripartite structure with a planning authority that's responsible for developing the sort of 5 to 10 year reconstruction plan, a financial authority that oversees the flow of funds, and then the implementers. These are the groups overseeing the implementation of projects, and that could be also at regional, local levels. There's always going to be tension between overregulation that stymies innovation and underregulation, allowing corruption. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Ed.
Thanks, Martina. Great. So just to conclude, rebuilding Ukraine will be one of the great tasks of the 21st century, right? The economic approach to rebuilding can be divided into maximizing benefits and reducing costs. And you saw Andrii give part of what we see as the maximizing benefits. And you saw Martina talking about trying to shift the rebuilding cost curve. Our model, Andrei's model, our model, highlights an equity efficiency trade-off between the West and the East. And I think that's something that Ukraine is going to have to grapple with. In general, I have been in my life a foe of what I've often seen as sort of muddle-headed attempts to sort of rebuild exactly what was there beforehand. But there's no question that there are issues that are beyond my ken that are involved in this particular thing. We have 3 strategies for lowering costs. We have openness, which partly I just want to sort of, it sounds nice in openness. It's the one thing I can't talk about whenever I talk to American legislators about reducing costs is like scrapping Buy American. So, we're terrible at this in America, but let's not think about rebuilding Ukraine as a jobs program. Let's make sure we think about it as a rebuilding program. Putting multiple objectives together does not make things better, it makes things worse. Secondly, standardization. Standardization is not just a weapon for lower costs. I mean, mass production is an amazing thing. And it's as valuable now as it was 250 years ago. But it's also a weapon against corruption. And it's much harder to cheat when you're actually buying something on Amazon than if you're doing something with a private contractor. And Ukraine has led the world in showing how effective military procurement of mass-produced drones can possibly be. Let Ukraine lead the world in showing how reconstruction can be based on mass-produced drones. Investing in investing, right? Sort of learning by doing is going to be part of it. Everybody screws up early on. When you rebuild, everyone screws up when you do military procurement early on. The key is to accept there'll be failure and to learn from what you're doing and to view it as a constant process in which we get better at doing it by paying attention and by having the humility to learn. Finally, right, needs for future research. Obviously, doing more on optimal timing of different types of infrastructure would be good. Doing more on working with a dynamic framework would be good. Formalizing issues of technology transfer and reconstruction, and analysis of the connection between mass production and cost. There's lots more to be done, and I think we need to view the reconstruction process as a constant learning process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Ufuk Akcigit will be the first discussant.
So I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to discuss this paper, and I would like to also congratulate the authors for this important paper. So of course, the big question here is, Ukraine is at an important historical crossroad. The question is, should Ukraine go back to what it used to be doing before the war, or should it write a new history? And of course, the answer to this question depends on how the Ukrainian economy looked like before the war. And so that's, this has been an issue that we've been thinking for almost 2 years now with some colleagues at the World Bank. And so there are some very important historical examples, like Germany, for instance, which we can call it as the Wirtschaftswunder, where by taking the right steps, the German economy has flourished after the Second World War, and now this is an important crossroad. Should the Ukrainian economy rebuild the past or engineer a new future? And the paper argues that it should build a new future, and I agree 100%. Okay, so now if we want to go into the details, the paper has some very important messages, and the paper really stands out for its key contribution on a highly policy relevant assessment of the construction cost and how to reshape the cost curve. And there, I think Ed also mentioned in his concluding remarks that openness, regulatory efficiency, procurement, these are all super important items to pay attention to. And I particularly like the term investing in investing, which is the preparatory phase before reconstruction. And there, institutional reforms, which was also something that we highlighted very heavily in our work. Vocational training for construction skills and stable electricity to power materials production, etc. These are, absolutely very important and essential, no doubt. Now, the paper also has some important statements in terms of, which regions to prioritize. And there, I think it's important to just go back and look at the big picture. How did the Ukrainian economy look like before the war? And Yuriy already showed something similar here. When you look at GDP per capita relative to the US here, you see a bunch of, success stories, historical success stories. Where is Ukraine? Ukraine is here. So, this is very much mimicking what Yuriy also showed. Until 2008, there's a visible acceleration, but after 2008, there are some important sliding backward. Now, I would like to go into a little bit more detail because, productivity seems to be an important issue when it comes to Ukraine. Here we look at labor productivity growth, and you can very visibly split the timing into 3 different episodes: before 2008, 2008 and 2013, and post 2013. And what you see here extremely visibly is that there was some improvement in the beginning, and then things have slowed down very visibly. So, we can all complain about the productivity estimations, and we don't know what productivity captures, and we don't know how to measure it, etc. But we know how to count bodies. So then, we can look at the labor dynamics, for instance, at the firm level to see how the Ukrainian economy has changed. And here, this is the highest quality data that you can get on the Ukrainian case in terms of the firm level balance sheet and firm registry data starting from 2002 all the way up to here. I would like to show you how Ukrainian firms behaved over time. So this is the life cycle of an average Ukrainian firm. On the x-axis, you see you have the age. On the y-axis, you have the relative employment. Before 2008, it looked like, almost like an American economy, to be honest. And between 2008 and 2013, it looks like a Mexican firm. After 2013, it looks like an Indian firm. Okay, so you see this gradual loss of dynamism in the Ukrainian economy during that time. And then, when you look at the selection is very critical. You need to let go the bad actors in the economy so that, there will be room for more productive players. And these are the selection dynamics. And what you see here is that the blue line, which is the very early stage, selection was very strong. And then the orange one shows that selection got weaker, significant. The green one, almost no selection basically towards the end. When you look at resource reallocation, there was some also mentioning of this in the beginning, the correlation between firm size and productivity. Ideally, you want productive firms to expand and dominate the market so that the overall efficiency is higher. And what you see here is that when you look at the correlation between firm size and efficiency until 2008, there's a visible improvement. Between 2008 and 2013, it stabilized. After 2013, it starts to get worse. And the final thing I would like to show you is that for productivity to improve, the productive firms should hire more workers. So, which is what we call in the literature, the responsiveness to productivity shocks. When we estimate the responsiveness to productivity shocks, early phase, very strong response, then this gets significantly weaker. So no matter how you slice the data, there's something extremely clear about the Ukrainian economy. Starting from 2002 onwards, there's a very, very, very sharp loss of dynamism. Okay. Now, I would like to come back to papers, main stylized facts. I think the main story here is that there has been a significant shift of economic activity from east to west. And as a result, the policy conclusion here is that reconstruction pays off most in Kiev, Lviv, Odessa, and Dnipro primarily because these regions, through the model-based estimation, they have the highest exogenous productivity. And that's why, when you want to rebuild, they will also create more externality, because of the agglomeration, etc. But everything originates from these productivity aspects. Now, the model, I don't have much time, so I don't want to go into detail, but Andrii did a great job in explaining the model. So let me now go to the big picture reactions here. First, the paper says that, the shift from east to west was probably a reflection of the fact that the economy moved from a planned economy to market economy. So planned economy distributes the resources more or less evenly across different regions, whereas the market forces have been shifting resources more towards the west. Now the question is, if that's the case, if things were inefficient and market forces are bringing more efficiency, how does this, compare to the aggregate dynamics that we saw? So that's why, when I look at the overall, the time series message from this exercise, it doesn't really line up with what I saw in the data, basically. Things are getting significantly worse and a lot worse. Of course, this is not the only determinant, but there's first, just trying to understand, of course, there are important limitations when it comes to data in Ukraine, but just looking at the time series, this doesn't really, compare well with what I had in mind. Now, of course, time series aggregate can be affected by many, many things. But then what about the cross section? So the paper's message is coming from the estimations from 2021, model-based estimation again, from 2021, where according to the estimation, Kiev and those regions are the most productive ones. Now that, we have the time series of the micro data, let's estimate this at the regional level. This is the very first phase, before 2008. Before 2008, the most productive regions are actually the eastern regions. So over time, the productivity starts shifting to west. And when things are really, really bad in the economy in terms of dynamism and corruption and all those things, we are estimating also consistently with the current paper that we are estimating the West to be more productive. So are we really estimating? So these final, from the later stage estimation, are we really capturing the fundamentals here? Or are we capturing with things that are going wrong on the East? Okay, because whatever suppresses the productivity is probably at the top of the list in terms of the pecking order of what to do. Because, if we just take these as fundamentals from 2021, these are the fundamentals, and not act on it, I think we might be misleading the discussion in that case. So why did the eastern regions fail so miserably in terms of their productivity and whatever that is? And we also know that incumbency capture has been a major problem. And there are many, many other things, as many people in this room know about this. So that's why, when it comes to measuring the fundamentals, which will be the exogenous component, which years should we rely on to really get to the bottom of this? So another, part that I think might help the paper significantly clarify is the following. So first, the wages in the model are determined from this top equation. The productivity AI has one-to-one relationship to the wage. Now, when it comes to estimating the productivity, what the paper does, that's the data available, uses the wages to back up the productivity from the second equation. Now, and since the wages are higher in Kiev and other regions, of course, this means that the productivity is higher in those regions. But what determines wages at the first place? Are there other things that are ignored in this analysis, like human capital, for instance? Or sectoral heterogeneity, are we really comparing apples to apples when we look at the wages across regions? Or also the market power. We know that incumbency capture and rise in concentration suppresses the wages. If in the East, incumbency capture has been a major issue, that might also artificially suppress the wages, and it might look like the wages are higher on the East because it's in the West because they are more productive. Maybe there are something wrong that's happening in the East that artificially makes us see as suppressed wages, for instance, which I think is an important consideration. Then probably this is my puzzle, but I think it would be good to clarify this in the paper is the following. So now, the productivity is the first equation, which has an exogenous A bar component, and then the population, and then I is the infrastructure. But unfortunately, again, data limitation applies to all of us here. So unfortunately, A bar and the infrastructure on the left in the second equation here, the last equation, is not separately identified. What the authors observe is the right side. As a result, the left-hand side, A bar and I are not separately identified. So, but the policy analysis here depends on what will happen if I increase AI by 1 unit, how much will we get in return? But this means that I need to know A bar because the social value of 1 unit of investment in infrastructure will be a function of A bar. But if I'm not able to separately identify those parts, I got a bit, lost there in terms of my thoughts, because, if, let's say, you want to assign 10 units to the left, whether you split it 10 to 1 versus 1 to 10 will have a very different implication. So what's the disciplining factor there in terms of separating exogenous productivity component, because that will have a first order implication on the welfare implications of infrastructure investment. So then my final comments would be, again, the productivity A bar, the fundamentals is the first order here. So that's why rather than going for a model-based estimation, why not using microdata directly to estimate A bars at the regional level? And that way, we can at least, of course, we commit that sin, all of us in this room commit that sin, but relying on theory to back out things. But here, I think it's particularly important to estimate the productivity, because that will lead to most of the policy conclusions here using the microdata. Another important thing, of course, this is just my personal bias. I spent my whole career thinking about not A itself, but A dot, you know, the how A dot changes. So of course, the paper takes the A term exogency, but how you're going to reconstruct infrastructure, you know, the AI infrastructure, how you're going to reconstruct universities, etc. These will have first order implications on A dot. So that's why I think thinking about, you know, how an idea or productivity production function has also at least as important as the infrastructure production function, so, or the cost function, basically. And incumbent capture was the #1 message coming from our analysis, basically. The reason there was a decline in dynamism in Ukraine, according to our analysis, was incumbency capture. So in an environment like this, whether you subsidize R&D, whether you reduce entry costs, whether you provide more loans, if there's incumbency capture, all the policy implications will be suppressed because there's a very clear interaction between the two. So I think, you know, and this was very much emphasized also in the previous panel, without thinking really seriously about the incumbency capture, you know, it's very hard to think about the policy recommendation here. And there was some interesting discussion, which I really liked, that the paper looked at, for instance, the construction sector and mentioned that 97% of the firms have less than 50 workers, which I interpret this as a positive message. But typically, when you have incumbency capture, it's not the average inequality or distribution of firms. It's 1 or 2 firms at the very top are dominating the whole sector, basically. Indeed, we saw in our analysis that, you know, 2-3 firms are capturing 70% of the market on average. So that's why, you know, it would be good to look at how in the construction sector also the 1 or 2 firms or 3 firms at the top are capturing the market share, and that will be important in terms of interpreting the concentration. And yeah, so I think again it's a super important work and very relevant for policy making, and I look forward to the iterations of the paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ufuk, second discussant matter.
Okay, so thank you to the organizers for putting this together and inviting me to talk about this paper. I wanted to, the question that this paper asks is, given cross sections of prices, of oblast level prices and wages, and a measure of destruction, what can we say about where to direct reconstruction dollars? Right, and the logic for that comes right from the rollback model, which I'm starting in the middle. I realized I've written my slides up for an urban audience, and I'm going to start with this. Right, so the way this works is like taking as given that which, in light of the last discussion, we might be skeptical about, taking as given that wages and prices are informative about like on the relevant underlying parameters. Okay, then imagine that we have 2 cities. All right, we're going to have the city where Shebnam lives and the city where Ed lives. Right, if the city where Shebnam lives has a wage of 20 and rents are 11, then people are consuming $9 there. The city where Ed lives has $20 wages and $10 rent, people are consuming $10. How can that happen in equilibrium? Right, there's $1 less of consumption. It has to be that there is some unexplained willingness to tolerate low consumption. Where Shebnam lives, that's an externality, right? So what we're looking for is we want to pile people up in places that are nice in that sense, where people are prepared to tolerate low consumption. That's the notion of amenities. Okay, you do something similar with productivity. Productivity is easier. It could map straight from wages, as we just saw. Okay, so then what we would like to do? Well, we would like to pile up our reconstruction dollars in places where amenities are most sensitive to reconstruction. All right. So where Shebnam lives, people are willing to stay there for $9 of consumption. Where Ed lives, it takes $10. It's a worse place. If we spend $1 of reconstruction money and suddenly people will live where Ed lives, with $9 of consumption. And if we spend $1 where Shebnam lives and it doesn't change, then spending the $1 where Ed lives is better. Okay. And so you can estimate all of those parameters from just those three cross sections. All you need to know is the sensitivity of wages to damage, which is the opposite of reconstruction, the sensitivity of rents to damage, which you can get in the cross-sectional regression. And then you do a weighted sum of rents and wages, and that will tell you basically the value of this unobserved attractiveness. You do the same thing for wages. All right. And those were two of the pictures that Andrii showed us. Okay. Right. Now, what they're doing is my little model is deficient in many ways. Right. I'm not keeping track of people moving back and forth. Right. I have this problem of figuring out how to weight productivity versus amenities. People are all the same. There's no heterogeneity of people. Once I address all of those problems, I land immediately on the model that Andrii wrote down. Right. So Andrei's model is exactly this little model that I've just articulated, with general equilibrium, with heterogeneous people, and being careful about, and sort of the general equilibrium bookkeeping. Right. So I'm always mistrustful of these. So the intuition, like, it's easy to look at these models, it's a lot of model hardware. I don't know if I believe this. The model hardware is doing just what I just explained. I am also very suspicious of these models, right? And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to just look at that calculation that I just showed you, which is this calculation, this particular weighted sum of rents and wages, which measures unexplained attractiveness of the place. All right. And if I do that, I get this map on the right. All right. The one on the left, I'm not keeping time here, I forgot. Okay. So I get that map, right, which shows that Kiev is a really nice place, which says that people are willing to live in Kiev in spite of the fact that after they pay their rent, they don't have very much money left. Okay, right. And now the one on the left is the one that comes out of the model. Okay, right. So let me show you where that one comes from. Right, that one comes. Oh shoot, wrong picture, wrong way. Back. All right. So what they want to do was so now we have this way of thinking about the marginal contribution to utility, the marginal contribution to productivity of investment, right? The last piece that we need to think about where to put investment is what's the price of investment, right? And so the object of this paper is to put together basically three maps, right? Really two. It's three. They're going to aggregate amenities and productivity into one by running it all through the machinery of an indirect utility function, right? So you need a map that shows the marginal contribution to utility of infrastructure investment. And then we need the price of investment. And if you put those two maps together, then you have a sense for where are the bargains, all right? And that's the object of this exercise. Okay. Now, that strikes me as an informative thing to do. And if all you have is three cross sections of data, like, seems like that's as good as you can hope for, right? Now, I think that this is not exactly the problem that they stated, right? And the problem they stated is a little bit different, right? Because there's a budget constraint, right, on infrastructure, right? As soon as you put that budget constraint in on infrastructure, you have a Lagrange multiplier floating around, which means the first order conditions are going to be different, right? And so I think the heuristic that they're proposing is informative. I would like to be a little clearer about the difference between the heuristic, the sort of heuristic solution, invest where the marginal social return is high and the cost is low, matches up to what you get out of when you actually are careful about keeping track of shadow prices, right? Because the constraint on infrastructure is going to bind, so that shadow price should not be zero, right? Which means that the first order conditions that we've just been talking about are not quite going to be right. Okay. That's the first thing. All right. I also think that this question where maximizing average utility subject to a budget constraint on infrastructure investment is not quite the problem that they have in mind, or I want to suggest a problem which I think is probably more, I want to suggest what I think is a better problem to think about, right? And that is down here at the bottom, right? Which is, I want to maximize the average utility by choice of investment across oblasts. Subject to, I have an infrastructure budget I have a public finance budget, like I have to pay for stuff. I'm gonna tax certain oblasts and subsidize others. I'm gonna buy infrastructure and I will have aid, right? When I add that second constraint in, I'm opening the door to taxing people who live in Kyiv to subsidize people who live in the countryside. Okay, and that expands the choice of things, that expands the set of things I'm considering dramatically. And we know that sort of that's the recent Fagelbaum and Glaeser paper sort of solve that problem. And that really that changes this paper a bit, that changes this problem a bit. And I think that's the problem that they have in mind. And in particular, right, that opens the door to thinking like, what is it going to look like in the end? Probably what's going to happen. So you're gonna have a bunch of people in Kyiv paying high taxes to subsidize fortresses on the eastern frontier. All right. So that means you want to be thinking about public finance, right? And public finance combined with location problems seem like that's a pretty important thing to be thinking about. Right. So if I'm going to tax people in Kyiv where they make a lot of money, right? Am I going to drive people away from Kyiv? Like maybe the best thing to do is to tax people in the countryside so that they'll move to Kyiv, where they will make more money, pay more taxes, and then we'll be able to fund the fortresses on the eastern frontier. Got it. All right. And that whole class of questions becomes available once you start thinking about this last constraint, subsidizing infrastructure, where I have to have, so if I impose some security constraint, I have to take a bunch of people out of the economy, workers out of the economy, plant them in oblasts on the east, and I have my infrastructure and public finance constraints. So I think that there's a bigger class of questions. So I think that this is the problem that these guys have in mind. They're giving us a heuristic, or they're giving us this very reduced form way to think about it, which is useful. I think it would be helpful to be a little clearer about the relationship between the basically three gradients that they're giving us in the solution to this problem, because this problem has shadow prices, has Lagrange multipliers floating around in it that you don't see in the sort of the three gradients that they're trying to develop. Okay. Then the last thing is the thing is the stuff about procurement, which I think is really neat. Okay, the way they're measuring procurement prices is there is a database that keeps track of contracts in Ukraine, which is great. Okay, and what they're going to the way they're going to measure the price of procurement is as the difference between the supervising engineer's estimate of the price and the eventual bid. Right, so it's basically the difference between the initial cost estimate and the price paid. Right, and so if that number is negative, that means that the initial price estimate was too high, and the competitive bidding drove it down low, and so that is the estimate of prices. The fact that that database exists, right, means that when we're starting to do procurement, we can think very carefully about the information we want to keep track of. Like, what are the names of the bidders? Have they been arrested before? Right? Sort of ask lawyers what to keep track of in that. And the second thing is the lawyers are very good. I have a friend who's a lawyer. I talked to him about how to do this, and he gave me a list of 10 things that you want to keep track of in the procurement database that I hadn't thought of. But there are things he's not going to know. All right. And what the procurement database is going to let us do is randomize over contract types that the lawyers don't know what's right. Right. And so having this database means that not only can you keep track of what people are doing, you can keep track of, are particular regions having trouble getting contracts filled on time? Are there particular supervising engineers who tend to run into trouble? So this is a powerful tool for tracking corruption. It's also a powerful tool for experimenting with contracting, right? And I think that is one of the really neat things to think about, given that they have this data. And that's it. Thanks for the chance to talk about this.
Great discussions, and now open to questions from the floor. Okay, I'll start with Yuriy.
Thanks very much. Great paper. I know it's a little outside the scope of your project, but one fact you mentioned in the presentation and in the paper is that housing stock is very, very old, very inefficient in many ways. If you want to address this problem, what would you do? Retrofit buildings or take them down and build something better and more beautiful? And the second question is this. Just before the war started, Zelensky had this program of the great construction when they built many, many roads. Do you see any lessons from that exercise when the government spent a lot of money on an infrastructure project? What was right, maybe not right? Thank you.
Can I ask about agglomeration economies? Your production system has a production only of houses and of the standardized commodity in the model. As I listened to you, I thought of a paper by Tony Venables, which we published in Oxford Review of Economic Policy a few years ago, essentially relevant to Brexit. And here's a caricature of the argument in 1 second. You'll see why it's relevant. There are two kinds of goods in this model. One are internationally traded goods. It's called the English car industry. And the other was driving around in Amazon vans delivering stuff. And once you do Brexit, you knock out the car industry. And it's in the car industry that there are agglomeration of economies. So that city parodies called Newcastle can never do back to getting anything highly productive again. And all the people end up there just driving around in delivery vans. And I wondered whether that's relevant in this model in selecting cities which are, let's just say, big enough to do agglomeration economies, but there may be something more selectively. I just did internationally traded goods versus non-traded. You may have another distinction. And if you do, then you would have a production system that produces houses and one of these kinds of goods and the other one without agglomeration economies. And it might give you a policy proposal about concentrating your redevelopment in cities where you could expect to get these agglomeration economies and not spend your money in places where, to parody, you'd end up with people just driving around in vans. Thanks.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you very much. Before the war, there was a big sort of change in institutions, the drive for decentralization, also supported by USAID and others in terms of responsibilities for financing and spending. So how does that affect your thinking for policy recommendations? Then the second question is actually to the discussant even. So basically, what are we mismeasuring in the model? Maybe we're mismeasuring the level of corruption in the East versus the West, because you did have a period before 2014 where the clan of Yanukovych came from the East and maybe had a much stronger hold there. And maybe that's the market is shifting, shifting away from that kind of corruption during the Poroshenko time. That's a guess. And then also on the firm efficiency, if you look at the European data on firm efficiency, you probably will see very similar charts, in terms of the big firms stay for longer, less productive, and they don't get cleaned from the market. So then who is Ukraine is supposed to learn from if it's looking for FDI from Europe? So how it's beyond your paper, but that's a question. And then finally, I'm glad you touched on the procurement. What can we learn in Europe from Ukrainian procurement, whether it's worth expanding upon?
Thank you. There's a card up there. Probably two. Okay, Alexander, go ahead.
Yeah, super fascinating paper. I was just wondering about this trade-off between efficiency and inequity that I think it's very important to think about. And I was thinking whether if your externality or productive externality is actually endogenous and depends on the selection of people, skilled and unskilled, the firms, efficient, less efficient, that move there, you might eventually think that this trade-off is relaxed, because as you move, more people, the selection get worse. So eventually you may think about like reducing the selection heterogeneity and entertaining the idea that this selection may eventually change the externality endogenously, may affect the tension. And this is a hope. And that eventually, these forces may even out and reduce that tension. Thanks.
Okay, great. Back to the authors.
So thank you for great discussions. Thank you for great questions. So Matt, I agree with you that the mega problem is the one that you stated, but we're not going to get to decide that mega problem, right? This is, as you well know, I mean, this is not like a central bank world in which the economists are in charge, right? We're able to suggest things and raise the issue of the regional issues and raise whether or not there are these trade-offs between these different regions. I do think, and I think we should do this, we should bring aid in, because I think you can bring aid in even with the current setup, even with the permutational approach, and say what would happen if you're also engaging in more redistribution across the regions in some way. But I'm not sure how eager I am to do the like the grand scheme of the whole thing with my simple static model. But it's and in some sense your point about the Lagrange multiplier is of course correct, but it's also, we're just looking at the benefit of a dollar spending, right? We're not asking ourselves about the cost of it, which is why the permutation doesn't enter in. To Ufuk's thing, and I'll let Andrii respond more, but I'll give you how I think about it and why I think goes on. Now, think about local productivity as reflecting two things. There's like whatever I is our infrastructure, which is some power rho, which has, and then there's everything else, right? Which is A, but it's also corruption and incumbent whatever, and it's all the other stuff. And the difference fundamentally is that the I is to a power rho, and so if I laid more on I, I'm going to get less return to that I, and so I don't want to take the fact that you've got a lot of I already as being a reason why I'm going to invest more of I. Whereas if I've got more, whatever that Z is, since it's multiplicative, that makes me want to do more I. And so those are the critical differences, at least how I see those two things. Now, I agree with you that in the measured cross section, it's impossible to know. But the critical word here is reconstruction. Because you're not like de novo, you're not just throwing out I, you're not just dumping cash, you're actually rebuilding particular infrastructure. And so you observe the I on the ground when you're building it. So reconstruction just means you're bringing it up to a particular level rather than to some extra stuff that you're laying in. And because of that, I think we're less likely to hit diminishing returns with the I, which is what you worry about if you identified that this region is productive because it's got a lot of I, is that you're going to hit diminishing returns really quickly, because it's the reconstruction aspect as opposed to just the throwing more stuff at it. And I think that's an important point that we should actually make in the paper, that in fact it's somewhat different to think about like that if you're labeling in more stuff de novo. But I should let Andrii also respond on the model. I'll stop up here and come back if there's other things that I don't think you.
Okay, so on the model, there were a few excellent comments on agglomeration from Ufuk and people in the audience. We model agglomeration in the simplest possible way. There are possible micro foundations for why agglomeration can be higher in some places, lower in other places, or non-existent in some places. There may be industry-related differences. There may be city size-related differences. This is all something that potentially can be done with our framework. I'm not sure if we have enough data to do all these possible extensions, but I think the basic idea of putting more resources in places where agglomeration is likely to be sizable is still going to be captured in our very simple model. I really liked Ufuk's point about agglomeration possibly driven by the loss of dynamism. We haven't thought about this, but we should definitely look more into your work. And I'm not sure how this would change our conclusions, but this definitely changes our understanding of what drives productivity in Ukraine.
You should say something about the Zelensky road building program, since none of us know anything about it.
I made a point more about this, but that's a very good point. Okay, so let me on a separate identification of A and I, we actually noted that, and we can separately identify them. That's in Appendix A, page 50 something. we probably should move it earlier in the paper. But yeah, that's an issue that we are aware of. Let me see. Okay. Let Martina do a little bit.
Okay, great. Thanks for the great discussions and all the really interesting comments. I'm going to pick up on a few related to reconstruction costs. On Ufuk's point on the concentration in construction, so Yuriy has written a paper using procurement data from the Ukraine and lots of European countries that shows that the construction sector is this real outlier in terms of concentration in public procurement. I think that's really relevant going forward. The Matt's point on Prozoro as being an environment where potentially different contract types could be randomized and tried out. I think that really ties in with this idea of learning by doing, and as going forward, seeing what we can learn about which type of auction designs work for which type of contracts and what type of information needs to be collected. On the Elina's point of what can be learned, there's a wealth of information already collected on Prozoro, as well on the type of firms that bid. So we know exactly which firms were bidding for contracts. We know exactly their bids. We know who was winning the bid, and with a bit of work that can be linked over time. So I think exactly there's information on complaints in the whole procedure. So I think this is it's really a poster child, or given as a poster child for how open procurement should be taking place. And I think part of this idea of investing could be to take programs like the Great Construction Program and map everything we know about the outcomes. That includes costs as well as the quality, who produced that infrastructure, to get a sense of the differences across different construction firms and the quality and quantity of infrastructure that they produced. That will be, I think, a very good starting point to do.
Yeah, there are a couple more that we didn't address. So, Yuriy, on your question about old housing stock, I think the biggest issue now is not that Ukraine doesn't have enough housing or that housing is old, is we don't have enough housing in places where people moved. Lviv, Uzhhorod, other Western places. I think it's important to prioritize construction there. Old housing stock is not necessarily a bad feature, right? Some of these old houses are more or less decent places to live. So I think that's something we should think about later when we have enough capacity to rebuild. And on Elina's points about decentralization reform, that's okay. So I see a case for relegating some of the reconstruction activities to local communities, but ultimately that's a nationwide effort, right? So I think there should be a lot of effort coming from the top down, and exactly how much of this should be done by local communities, I'm not qualified to answer, but that's something to think about.
I think it's useful to differentiate between public space and private space on this. I think by and large, private space can be completely decentralized. It's not an issue of government even. It's an issue of sort of local building. The public stuff, it's going to depend on what the public spaces are doing, whether or not it's sort of local roads or national roads, whether or not it's and so forth. But we don't want to lose scale. We don't want to lose the ability to learn. One institutional design that's really attractive is the sort of Japanese zoning model. So Japan gives localities the ability to choose what type of zoning they want, but there are only 9 things on the menu. So you can't actually have your own, as like every Massachusetts town has their own utterly idiosyncratic zone. You can choose low density residential in Japan. Like you're allowed to choose that, but that means any other place that's low density residential does exactly the same thing. The beauty of this design is it makes it really easy to figure out how to build in lots of different places. And so it enables the scale economies to work. And Japan has been great in terms of having sort of very high quality, very nice mass produced housing. And I agree completely actually with what Ufuk said. I think like the essence of housing is its durability. It lasts. America is full of places with cheap, crappy housing. And we don't think it's like a national crisis to to replace it with better housing. But that being said, some part of me still has a dream that like one of the things that will come out of this is that sort of Ukraine will end up being the world's leading producer of high quality, mass produced housing that will be an export industry for the country going forward.
Ufuk, you want to? Yeah.
There was one question. So on what we are measuring question, so the big driver here is when we invest one additional unit into infrastructure, the ABARD exogenous component will influence the social return. I might have the best technology in the world, but if it's captured by people who are close to government, etc., and they are not letting me use my technology, everything can be suppressed. And we know that in those environments, wages are also being influenced. Indeed, Larry Katz and John Van Rijn and co-authors had this paper showing that more concentrated industries are paying lower to their wages. Now, in this analysis, the only source of information for productivity is wage, because that's how you invert the metrics. And that's why, whatever goes into the wage determination across the regions will also feed into productivity. That's why I was saying that probably it might be a promising direction to start from microdata to make a bit more progress. You mentioned FDI question, fantastic question. Indeed, in our analysis, we looked at, for instance, the source of FDI going into Ukraine. And if the FDI is coming from tax havens, when the money comes into that industry, dynamism collapses in those. So because, you want FDI because you want good spillover, high quality spillover, but not every FDI is associated with that. So that's why I think, it's also important to monitor, with which countries there are partnerships, because international partnerships is an important source of knowledge flow into the country. So not any FDI, but high quality FDI should be the target during the rebuilding phase. Korea exactly built on that, right? A lot of subsidies were offered to licensing technologies from Japan and from the US, and China did something similar. High quality FDI is important.
Well, can I ask you about market power and how you think about it? So when I think about the sort of, like, let's say there happens to be in place A, there's an evil ogre who has figured out how to steal all the money from the workers. Now, you may say policy approaches, I got to get rid of that ogre. And I'm fine on that, but I don't know how to get rid of ogres. But I do know that, I probably don't want to put more infrastructure where there's the ogre. And that's at least how I think about, the sort of kleptocracy version of this, they just treat the ogre as another part of EA, even though I agree it's not the technology, it's the wicked ogre who's taking the money.
Very good question. Indeed, I've been working very intensely with models where the market power and wage determination is endogenous, and that's how we explained also decline in dynamism in the US. The fact that conglomerates are getting so powerful that it suppresses the wages. So that's why, to me, the wage is part of the story. Of course, one approach is that in the very short run, I cannot really fight against these. So where should I put infrastructure? But to me, infrastructure will really determine the long-term trajectory of the economy. Where you're putting in the whole computing system, the bridge, the roads will determine how things will shape up. And if I get influenced already by the dominance or by things going wrong in that neighborhood, to me, it's a bit like, starting with the wrong button. We have to tackle, probably for a long-term vision. This is a short-term solution, which I totally respect. But if the goal is to put Ukraine in a long-term trajectory that will be different, then the story should be different, I think. And there has to be a potentially international effort also to tackle this type of problem, because otherwise all the money that will be flowing into the country will deliver much lower return.
I don't view that as being, I'm totally friendly towards that comment, but and if we thought we knew what like roads and bridges are going to do to the ogre, and we thought that somehow or other we could defeat the ogre with the right combination of roads and bridges, then that's great. But I don't know how to use roads and bridges to defeat the ogre. So it's the question that we set out to solve. It doesn't relate. In fact, the only way in which we get things wrong, if the wages are low because of the whatever it is, the conglomerate, the insiders, it's a question if we actually valued the extra rents going to the ogre, then you want to sort of say, oh, it's not so bad to invest where the ogre is because the ogre is really enjoying your money. So that's the only way and I don't think we're inclined to do that.
All right. Anything to add? Any questions? Great. So let me say a few words before we end. First of all, thank you for all the presenters, authors, discussants for this very stimulating a day and a half. And I would like to, of course, thank first and foremost our board members, CEPR, CESifo, and CESifo, Clemens, Charles, and Maurice. They're all here. And also I would like to thank the most important people that makes this happen. It wouldn't happen without them. Marilona Chichone here, Volkan, and also Hania, I believe here. So big applause. And now we have lunch, correct? Okay, and it's here? Yeah. Okay, great. So let's have lunch and see you in Venice, June 19 and 20.
Thank you, Shabnam.